Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
The emergency call came at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday that had already stretched too long. I'd been reviewing intake assessments, trying to clear my backlog before the morning shift arrived. Dr. Patricia Hammond, lead psychiatric counselor for the adolescent wing, needed in observation suite C immediately. The security guard met me at the elevator. His usual professional composure cracked around the edges. "Sorry to drag you down here, Doc. Got a situation with the new patient, the Morrison girl." Night supervisor tried to handle it, but something's wrong with the equipment. I followed him through corridors that felt different in the small hours. Longer, quieter, filled with the institutional hum of fluorescent lights and distant ventilation systems. The observation suite was our pride. A state-of-the-art behavioral monitoring room with sophisticated recording equipment and mirror glass that allowed therapists to observe sessions without disrupting the therapeutic environment. Through the observation window, I could see a teenage girl sitting motionless at the small table. Janet Morrison, according to her chart, 16, admitted 3 days ago following a dissociative episode triggered by her parents' divorce. She stared straight ahead at the mirrored wall, her hands folded precisely in her lap, breathing so controlled it seemed rehearsed. "Where's the night supervisor?" I asked. "That's the problem." The guard gestured toward the observation room. "She went in 40 minutes ago to start the emergency evaluation." But look, I pressed closer to the one-way glass. Janet sat alone at the table. No second chair, no supervisor, no indication anyone else had been in the room. The therapy space looked exactly as it should. Sterile, controlled, empty, except for one patient waiting patiently for someone to begin. Equipment malfunction, I concluded. The intercom probably cut out. "Where's Supervisor Chen now?" "That's what I'm trying to tell you." She never came out. A chill ran down my spine, but I maintained professional calm. "She must have used the exit door. These old buildings have multiple egress points." The guard shook his head. "Only one way in or out of that room, Doc. I've been watching the corridor. Nobody came past me." I checked the scheduling system on my tablet. Janet Morrison, emergency evaluation, 2 Zhao a.m. to 3 Naller a.m., assigned to night supervisor Chen. But when I looked at the staff directory, there was no record of anyone named Chen on our night shift roster. "I'll handle the evaluation myself," I said, though my hands were already trembling slightly. The therapy room felt smaller than usual when I entered, as if the walls had shifted inward by imperceptible degrees. Janet didn't acknowledge my presence, continuing to stare at the mirror with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Janet, I'm Dr. Hammond. I understand you've been waiting." She moved her lips slightly, forming words I couldn't hear, as if responding to a conversation only she could perceive. "Can you tell me what you're looking at?" "The other doctor," she said quietly, her voice carrying the flat affect common in dissociative episodes. "She's still in there behind the glass." She looked scared. I glanced at the mirror. My own reflection stared back, tired, slightly disheveled from the late hour, but alone. The one-way glass showed only the observation room beyond, empty and dark. "Janet, there's no one behind the mirror. It's just us in here. Would you like to talk about what you're experiencing?" She turned to face me then, her eyes focusing with disturbing clarity. "You can't see her?" "Dr. Chen is standing right behind you. She's trying to say something, but her mouth isn't working right." The hair on my arms stood up. I'd never mentioned the name Chen to Janet. As far as the official record showed, no such person existed on our staff. "Janet, how do you know that name?" She told me. During our session, she was asking about the accident, about what I saw in the rearview mirror before everything went dark. Janet's voice remained eerily calm. She seemed to understand about seeing things that other people can't see. I spent the next hour documenting Janet's responses, her fixation on the mirror, her references to invisible observers and impossible conversations, standard dissociative behavior, triggered by trauma and exacerbated by the reflective surface. But throughout the session, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us from behind the glass. Not Janet's delusion, but something else. something patient and still and deeply familiar. The next morning, I requested the security footage from Suite C. The timestamp showed my entire session with Janet, but there were anomalies in the video that the technical department couldn't explain. For brief moments, no more than a few seconds at a time, my reflection in the mirror appeared to lag behind my actual movements, as if the image were struggling to keep pace with reality. Digital compression artifacts, the technician assured me. The system sometimes creates minor delays when processing reflective surfaces. Nothing to worry about. But when I enhanced the footage frame by frame, I found something that made my blood run cold. In several shots, my reflection remained visible in the mirror after I'd moved completely out of frame. For just a moment, the reflection would linger, watching Janet with an expression of concern I didn't remember making. I scheduled another session with Janet for the following week, this time with a colleague observing from the booth. Dr. Sarah Torres was methodical, rational. If something unusual happened, she'd document it properly and help me understand what I was seeing. Janet took the same chair, faced the same mirror, and immediately began the same disturbing routine. "She's back," Janet said without preamble. "Dr. Chen, she wants to know why you keep coming here." I kept my voice steady, professional. "What does she look like, Janet?" "Like you, but older. Her hair is different, shorter, grayer. She's wearing scrubs instead of regular clothes." Janet paused, tilting her head as if listening to something. "She says she used to work here before you came. She wants to know if you found her research notes." From the observation booth, Dr. Torres's voice crackled through the intercom. "Patient appears to be addressing her own reflection. Possible mirror self-recognition disorder," but Janet shook her head vigorously. "Not my reflection, hers." She pointed directly at me. "Dr. Chen is standing behind Dr. Hammond again. She looks worried about something." I turned to look at the mirror. My reflection was there, normal and alone, slightly distorted by the institutional lighting. But for just a moment, I thought I saw something else. A second figure, translucent and overlapping, wearing the blue scrubs that our night staff had worn before the uniform change 6 months ago. "She says her name was Patricia Chen," Janet continued. "She worked the Adolescent Crisis Intervention Program. She wants to know what happened to her files." My breath caught. Patricia Chen had been my predecessor in the adolescent program, the counselor who died in a car accident 4 months before I was hired. I'd inherited her cases, her office, even some of her furniture, but I'd never mentioned her name to Janet, and there was no way a patient admitted 3 days ago could know about someone who'd been dead for months. "Janet, how could you possibly know about Dr. Chen?" she told me. During our sessions, Janet's voice remained maddeningly calm. "She said she used to help kids like me, kids who saw things differently. She understood about the mirror problem." I checked Janet's file again. "Admission date, 3 days ago. Patricia Chen's death, 4 months ago." The timeline made no sense. The session continued, but I found myself glancing compulsively at the mirror. Each time I looked, my reflection seemed slightly wrong, delayed or too still, or focused on something beyond the glass that I couldn't see. After Janet was escorted back to her room, I stayed in the observation suite with Dr. Torres, reviewing the footage in real time. "There," I said, pausing the video. "Look at the reflection during minute 23. Dr. Torres leaned closer to the monitor. "I see your reflection." "What am I looking for?" "The position." I'm leaning forward in the chair, but my reflection is sitting back, arms crossed. She studied the screen carefully. "It looks normal to me, Patricia. Maybe you should take some time off." But I could see it clearly. My reflection moving independently, responding to conversations I wasn't part of, showing expressions I wasn't making. That night, I accessed Patricia Chen's personnel file through the administrative database. She'd specialized in adolescent crisis intervention, had shown particular interest in dissociative disorders and reality perception issues. Her final case notes mentioned experiments with the observation suite, something about therapeutic presence continuity, and persistent observer states. The last entry in her research log was dated the day before her accident. Mirror therapy shows promise for reality anchoring in dissociative patients. Subject's report continued therapeutic connection even after session termination. Requires further investigation into observer persistence phenomena. I returned to the observation suite after hours, alone. The mirror room was dark, but I could see my reflection clearly in the one-way glass. For a long moment, I stared at myself, looking for any sign of the anomaly I'd seen in the recordings. Then I spoke to the empty room. "Patricia, if you're here, I need to understand what's happening." My reflection remained perfectly still for several seconds after I stopped speaking. Then slowly it nodded. "I don't use the observation suite anymore. The room has been reassigned to another counselor, someone who doesn't seem bothered by the occasional equipment malfunctions or the patients who insist on addressing empty spaces behind the glass. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of breathing from behind mirrors, in the bathroom, in my office, in the reflection of my car windows. It's patient, steady, like someone keeping watch over cases that never quite closed. Janet was transferred to another facility last month. Her final session note, written in handwriting I don't recognize, simply read, "Therapeutic relationship successfully transferred. Observer continuity maintained. Patient reports decreased anxiety regarding mirror phenomena. I've stopped looking in mirrors after dark, though I know someone's always there, keeping detailed notes on sessions that continue long after the official appointments end. Some therapeutic relationships, I've learned, persist beyond the boundaries of life and death, maintained by reflections that remember what the living world has forgotten." The scream echoed through Ward C at 11:47 p.m. just as I was finishing my final chart review. 3 patients had reported the same nightmare, standing in an empty hospital corridor, calling for help that never came. My official shift ended at 11, but documentation always ran late. Better to finish the paperwork than face the morning supervisor's questions about incomplete records. The night security guard had already made his first rounds, checking locks and signing off on the evening medication logs. I should have left then. Instead, I decided to walk the ward one final time, ensuring all patients were settled before heading home. Standard protocol, really, the kind of thoroughness that separated good counselors from mediocre ones. The corridor felt different after hours, longer somehow, with shadows that stretched further than the fluorescent fixtures should have allowed. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound were bouncing off walls that had shifted slightly out of their daytime positions. Room 301, Emma Patterson, 17, admitted for self-harm behaviors. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any signs of distress. Instead, I heard her voice, low and conversational, as if she were talking to someone. "Dr. Haley was always good to us," she was saying. "Even after what happened to her, Dr. Haley, that was my name." But Emma was speaking about me in the past tense, as if I were no longer present in her life. I moved to the next room. Michael Torres, 16, severe depression following his parents' divorce. Again, I heard muffled conversation through the heavy door. She used to run the midnight checks. Michael's voice was saying, "Made sure everyone was safe before she died." My blood ran cold. "Before she died," I pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more. "The accident was on a Tuesday," a second voice replied, Sarah Kim from room 304, who rarely spoke during group sessions. "She was driving home late, like always. The other car ran the red light, but she still comes around," Michael continued. "The nurses see her sometimes, finishing her paperwork." I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. What accident? I was alive, standing in the corridor, listening to patients discuss my death as if it were established fact. Room 306, James Mitchell, 15, anxiety disorder with panic episodes. His voice drifted through the door, clearer than the others. "Dr. Haley doesn't know yet," he was saying. "She keeps doing her rounds, checking on us. Someone should tell her." Tell her what? This was Ashley Rivera from 308, somehow part of a conversation happening in a different room. That she's been dead for 6 months, ever since the night shift accident. My legs nearly gave out. 6 months ago, I'd started working the extended evening schedule to help with the staffing shortage. 6 months ago, I'd begun staying late to finish documentation, leaving the hospital near midnight most nights. But I was alive. I could feel my pulse, my breathing, the weight of my body moving through the corridor. I fumbled for my keys, unlocking the staff office to check the duty roster. The logbook lay open on the supervisor's desk, today's entries filled out in various handwritings. I flipped to the night shift section. There, in the 11 p.m. slot, was my name, Dr. Rebecca Haley. Deceased during night observation rounds. The entry was initialed with my own signature. I stared at the page, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had written deceased next to my name, but the handwriting looked exactly like mine. The initial matched my usual mark perfectly. I grabbed the previous day's log. Same entry, Dr. Rebecca Haley. Deceased during night observation rounds, and the day before that, and the week before. 6 months of identical entries, all describing my death during nighttime duties, all signed with my own initials. Dr. Haley? I spun around. James Mitchell stood in the doorway wearing his standard-issue hospital pajamas. His expression was gentle, almost pitying. James, you should be in your room. It's past midnight. You always say that, he replied. Every night when you find us talking. You always think it's past midnight. I checked my watch. 11:52 p.m. It is past midnight. James shook his head slowly. Dr. Haley, what time did your shift end? 11 o'clock. And what time is it now? I looked at my watch again. 11:52 p.m. The same time it had been a moment ago. The second hand wasn't moving. The accident happened at 11:52, James said gently. You were leaving late, like always. The drunk driver ran the intersection just as you pulled out of the parking garage. That's not possible. I'm standing here talking to you. You're standing here doing your final rounds, James corrected. Same as every night for the past 6 months. You check on us, make sure we're safe, then try to leave. But you never make it past 11:52. Other patients had gathered in the corridor now. Emma, Michael, Sarah, Ashley. They stood in a loose semicircle watching me with expressions of profound sadness. We tried to tell you before, Emma said. But you never remember the next night. You start over, finishing your paperwork, making your final checks. The nurses know, Michael added. They see you sometimes walking the halls after midnight. But they can't interact with you directly. We can talk to you because we're patients, Sarah explained. Because you cared about us so much that part of you stayed behind to keep us safe. I backed toward the staff office, shaking my head. This isn't happening. I'm alive. I have a life outside this hospital. When did you last go home? Ashley asked quietly. When did you last eat a meal that wasn't from the hospital cafeteria? When did you last sleep in your own bed? I tried to remember. My apartment, my cat, my morning routine before coming to work. The memories felt distant, faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. You've been taking care of us for 6 months, James said. Even after the accident, you kept doing your job. But Dr. Haley, you need to let go now. We're safe. I looked down at my watch. 11:52 p.m. The same time, always the same time. What happens if I leave? You find peace, Emma said. And we learn to take care of ourselves like we're supposed to. I walked slowly back to the staff office, looking at the duty log one final time. Dr. Rebecca Haley, deceased during night observation rounds. My handwriting, my signature, acknowledging a truth I'd been unable to accept. I set down my keys, turned off the desk lamp, and walked toward the exit. The corridor stretched longer than usual, but I could see light at the end. Not the harsh fluorescent glow of institutional fixtures, but something warmer, more welcoming. Behind me, I heard the patients returning to their rooms, settling into sleep without my watchful presence for the first time in 6 months. The clock on the wall read 11:53 p.m. as I stepped through the door and finally went home. The manila folder slipped from my hands at 3:17 a.m., scattering papers across the break room floor like oversized confetti. I'd been working late again, catching up on documentation that should have been completed days ago. The Millbrook Adolescent Treatment Center required all therapy session notes to be typed, printed and filed within 24 hours of patient contact, a policy that sounded reasonable until you factored in the reality of back-to-back sessions and crisis interventions. Knelt to collect the scattered transcripts, sorting them by patient name and date.
Henderson, Maria. Session 12, Progress Notes on Family Therapy Integration.
Williams, Marcus. Emergency Consultation. Self-Harm Risk Assessment. Park, Jennifer. Group Therapy Participation. Behavioral Observations. Then I found a transcript I'd never seen before. The header looked standard. Patient, Dr. Amanda Reeves. Therapist, redacted. Session date, today's date. Session number 47, Dr. Amanda Reeves. That was my name. I stared at the document, trying to process what I was seeing. According to this transcript, I was the patient, not the therapist. But I'd never been in therapy at Millbrook. I was staff, not a client. And session number 47 suggested an ongoing treatment relationship that had been continuing for months. The transcript began normally enough. Therapist: Good afternoon, Amanda. How are you feeling today? Patient: Dr. Reeves. I'm tired. The late nights are getting harder to manage. Sometimes I lose track of time completely. Therapist: Tell me about losing track of time. Patient: Dr. Reeves. I'll be reviewing files and suddenly it's 3 in the morning. I don't remember the hours passing. It's like I blink and the clock jumps forward. My hands were trembling as I read. This was my voice, my speech patterns, my concerns, my exact experience of the past few months. But I had no memory of participating in this conversation. Therapist: Have you considered that this might be a symptom rather than simple overwork? Patient: Dr. Reeves. A symptom of what? Therapist: We've discussed this before, Amanda. The dissociative episodes, the memory gaps, the persistent belief that you're a functioning therapist rather than a patient receiving treatment. I read the line 3 times, each repetition hitting me like a physical blow. Dissociative episodes, memory gaps, the persistent belief that I was a therapist rather than a patient. Patient: Dr. Reeves. I am a therapist. I have patients. I conduct sessions every day. Therapist: Amanda, we need to talk about your admission date. Do you remember coming to Millbrook? Patient: Dr. Reeves. I work at Millbrook. I've been on staff for 3 years. Therapist: You've been a patient here for 8 months. Your family committed you after the incident at your previous job. The transcript continued for several more pages, documenting a conversation I had no memory of participating in. According to the notes, I'd been admitted to Millbrook as a patient following a severe psychological break at my previous position. The incident wasn't specified, but references were made to professional boundary, violations, reality testing, issues, and elaborate delusional systems, involving therapeutic role, assumption, therapist, the fantasy that you're treating patients is a coping mechanism, Amanda. Your mind created this alternate reality to avoid processing the trauma that brought you here. Patient: Dr. Reeves. This isn't a fantasy. I have files. I have appointments scheduled for tomorrow. Therapist: The files are part of your therapeutic exercises. Writing fictional case notes helps you process your own psychological material. The appointments are your own therapy sessions, which you've reframed as professional meetings. I set the transcript down, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was impossible. I was Dr. Amanda Reeves, licensed counselor, employed by Millbrook Adolescent Treatment Center. I had an office, a caseload, professional responsibilities. But even as I thought this, details began feeling strangely uncertain. When had I last gone home? When had I last eaten a meal that wasn't from the hospital cafeteria? When had I last interacted with colleagues outside of brief professional exchanges? I tried to remember my apartment, my car, my life outside these walls. The memories felt thin, insubstantial, like trying to recall a dream hours after waking. I grabbed my employee ID from my pocket. Dr. Amanda Reeves, clinical counselor, employee, 4471. The plastic card felt real, solid, legitimate, but when I looked at it more closely, the photo seemed wrong. My face looked younger, less tired, as if the picture had been taken years ago. The issue date was 8 months ago, exactly when the transcript claimed I'd been admitted as a patient. I rushed to my office, key in hand, needing to prove to myself that my professional life was real. The door opened normally, revealing the familiar space I'd occupied for 3 years. Diplomas on the walls, patient files in locked cabinets, appointment calendar on the desk. But something was off. The diplomas, when I examined them closely, had dates that didn't align with my memories. My master's degree showed a graduation date 5 years in the future. My licensure was listed as pending review. The name on the certificates kept shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. I opened the filing cabinet to check my active cases. The folders were there: Henderson, Williams, Park, all the patients I'd been treating. But when I pulled out Jennifer Park's file, the pages were blank except for repeated writings of my own name, over and over, in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic toward the bottom of each page. Marcus Williams' file contained only crayon drawings of stick figures sitting in chairs, labeled Dr. Reeves and Patient in childlike script. Maria Henderson's folder held pages of what appeared to be therapy notes, but all written from the patient's perspective, describing sessions with an increasingly unstable counselor who confused her own problems with those of her clients. The appointment calendar on my desk showed meetings for tomorrow, but when I looked closer, they were all with the same person. Dr. A. Reeves, 9 OBM, 11 ADM, 2 SAR PM, 4 SARS PM. My own name, scheduled in different time slots throughout the day. I sank into my chair, the transcript still clutched in my shaking hands. I forced myself to read the final entries. Therapist, Amanda. I need you to consider the possibility that your entire professional identity is a construction designed to avoid dealing with your own psychological crisis. Patient, Dr. Reeves. If that's true, then who are you? Who am I talking to? Therapist. I'm the part of your mind that's still trying to heal. The therapeutic voice you developed during your training, now attempting to treat the patient you've become. Patient, Dr. Reeves. That's not possible. Therapist. Look around your office, Amanda. Really look. What do you see? I looked around my office with new eyes. The diplomas were clearly altered, the names changing each time I focused on them. The patient files contained nothing but therapeutic exercises disguised as professional documents. The appointment calendar was a fantasy schedule, organizing my own therapy sessions into a structure that felt like normal work. Patient, Dr. Reeves. How long have I been here? Therapist, 8 months. Since the breakdown at your previous job. Patient, Dr. Reeves. What happened there? Therapist. You began identifying too strongly with your patients. You started believing their traumas were your own, their healing was your responsibility. Eventually, you couldn't distinguish between being a therapist and being someone who needed therapy. Patient, Dr. Reeves. And now? Therapist. Now you've created an elaborate fantasy where you're treating patients at a facility where you're actually receiving treatment. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism, Amanda, but it's preventing you from getting the help you need. The transcript ended with a line that made my blood run cold. Therapist. Accept your diagnosis, doctor. Only then can we begin your real treatment. I sat in my office, or was it a patient room decorated to look professional? Reading and rereading the transcript. Outside the window, I could see other buildings of the Millbrook complex. But for the first time, I noticed the bars on the windows, the security cameras, the high fences topped with wire. The manila folder I'd dropped contained dozens of similar transcripts, all documenting conversations between Dr. Amanda Reeves, the patient, and various therapeutic voices she'd created to avoid confronting her own psychological collapse. Session after session of elaborate self-therapy, disguised as professional work with fictional patients. At the bottom of the folder was the admission form, signed 8 months ago. Patient exhibits severe dissociative episodes and professional identity confusion following workplace psychological crisis. Recommend intensive reality testing therapy and gradual reintegration of authentic self-concept. The signature at the bottom was mine, but I had no memory of signing it. I looked at my appointment calendar one more time. Tomorrow's schedule still showed multiple sessions with Dr. A. Reeves, but now I understood. They weren't appointments with patients. They were my own therapy sessions, scheduled throughout the day, disguised by my mind as professional meetings to make them psychologically tolerable. The door to my office opened, and a woman in scrubs entered. Not a patient, but a nurse. Dr. Reeves, she said gently, it's time for your evening medication. Dr. Harrison is pleased with your progress. She thinks you're almost ready to acknowledge your patient status. I looked at the transcript one final time, then carefully placed it back in the folder. Tomorrow I would attend my appointments with Dr. A. Reeves. But for the first time in 8 months, I would go as a patient seeking help, not a therapist pretending to provide it. The fantasy had been comfortable, but the transcript had shown me the truth. Sometimes the most sophisticated defense against psychological crisis is the illusion that you're qualified to cure it yourself. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept gripping the mug like an anchor as I watched Dr. Sarah Chen conduct what appeared to be the most effective therapy session I'd witnessed in 20 years. Through the observation window, I could see her sitting perfectly still across from Marcus Rivera, a 17-year-old who hadn't spoken voluntarily since witnessing his father's suicide 6 months ago. Dr. Chen hadn't said a word in the 40 minutes I'd been observing, neither had Marcus. Yet, something profound was happening in that room. Marcus's posture had shifted from the defensive hunch he'd maintained for weeks to an open, receptive position. His hands, usually clenched or hidden, rested peacefully in his lap. Most remarkably, tears were streaming down his face, not the bitter tears of anger I'd seen before, but something that looked like relief. At the session's end, Marcus stood up, walked to Dr. Chen, and embraced her with the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been truly understood. She returned the hug briefly, then watched him leave with an expression of gentle satisfaction. I entered the therapy room immediately after Marcus left. Sarah, that was remarkable. How did you achieve such a breakthrough without any verbal interaction? Dr. Chen looked at me with mild surprise, as if she'd forgotten I was observing. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. After a moment, she simply smiled and gathered her notes. Sarah, are you all right? She nodded, pointed to her throat, and made a gesture I interpreted as indicating laryngitis or some other temporary voice issue. Then she wrote on her notepad, "Session notes in your office by 5 p.m. This had been our arrangement for the past 3 weeks since Dr. Chen joined our adolescent crisis team. She was remarkably effective with our most challenging patients, kids with severe trauma, selective mutism, treatment-resistant depression. But she never spoke during sessions, claiming various temporary voice problems that somehow never resolved. I'd initially attributed her silence to a medical condition, but her session notes were so insightful, so professionally sophisticated that I didn't question her methods. Results spoke louder than words, and Dr. Chen was producing results that bordered on miraculous. That afternoon, I found her notes on my desk, written in precise handwriting. Marcus Rivera. Session 12. Patient achieved significant breakthrough regarding survivor guilt. Through nonverbal therapeutic presence, patient was able to access repressed grief about father's death. Recommend continued silent processing sessions. Patient responds better to presence than to verbal intervention. The analysis was brilliant, but it raised questions I'd been avoiding. How could she conduct such sophisticated therapy without speaking? How could patients achieve breakthroughs without any apparent communication? I decided to review Dr. Chen's personnel file, something I'd been meaning to do since her arrival, but had postponed due to her obvious competence. The file was completely empty, not minimal, empty. No resume, no references, no educational credentials, no previous employment history. The folder labeled Dr. Sarah Chen contained only a single sheet. Her name, today's date, and the notation, temporary assignment, adolescent crisis intervention. I called Human Resources immediately. Janet, I need information about our new counselor. Dr. Sarah Chen, her personnel file is incomplete. A long pause. Dr. Martinez, we don't have anyone named Sarah Chen on staff. Are you sure about the name? She's been working here for 3 weeks. She's assigned to the adolescent crisis team. I'm looking at our complete staff roster. There's no Dr. Chen in any department. Could you be thinking of Dr. Sarah Schwartz from the adult wing? I hung up, my hands trembling slightly. Dr. Sarah Schwartz was a 60-year-old woman with red hair and a boisterous personality. Dr. Chen was perhaps 35, Asian, with black hair and a serene demeanor that had made me assume she was naturally quiet, even before her supposed voice problems began. I returned to the therapy wing, looking for Dr. Chen to resolve this administrative confusion. I found her in the group therapy room, sitting in a circle with 6 of our most difficult patients. All of them were staring at her with rapt attention, occasionally nodding or wiping away tears, as if engaged in the most meaningful conversation of their lives. Dr. Chen sat in perfect stillness, her hands folded, her expression radiating calm understanding. She wasn't speaking, wasn't gesturing, wasn't providing any visible form of therapeutic intervention, but every patient in the room was engaged, responsive, clearly processing deep emotional material. I entered the room. Excuse me, I need to speak with Dr. Chen privately. The patients turned to look at me with expressions of confusion and mild annoyance, as if I'd interrupted something important. Dr. Chen smiled apologetically at the group, then followed me into the corridor. Sarah, I need to ask you some questions about your employment here. Human Resources has no record of your hiring. She looked genuinely puzzled, then wrote on her notepad, administrative error. I was assigned here 3 weeks ago. Assigned by whom? She paused, pen hovering over paper, then wrote, I don't remember. The assignment felt natural. Where did you work before coming here? Another long pause. She wrote, I'm not sure. This feels like where I've always belonged. A chill ran down my spine. Sarah, what's your last memory before arriving at Millbrook? She stared at the notepad for several minutes, then wrote, driving to work. It was raining. There was an accident. What kind of accident? I don't remember after that. I just remember knowing I needed to be here, helping these kids. That evening, I searched local news archives for recent car accidents involving anyone named Sarah Chen. What I found made my stomach drop. 3 weeks ago, exactly when Dr. Chen had appeared at Millbrook, a 34-year-old psychologist named Dr. Sarah Chen had been killed in a single car accident during a rainstorm. She'd been driving to her job at a youth crisis center across town when she lost control on a curve and struck a tree. The obituary mentioned her specialized work with traumatized adolescents, her innovative approaches to nonverbal therapy, and her belief that healing could occur through presence alone, without the need for traditional talk therapy. I stared at the photograph accompanying the obituary. It was undeniably the same woman who'd been working in our facility for 3 weeks. The next morning, I arrived early, hoping to confront Dr. Chen with this information. But her usual office was empty. The nameplate had been removed, the desk cleared of personal items. It was as if she'd never been there. I went to the group therapy room where she'd been scheduled to meet with the adolescent crisis team. The 6 patients were already there, sitting in their usual circle, staring at an empty chair where Dr. Chen typically sat. Where's Dr. Chen? I asked. Marcus Rivera looked up at me with profound sadness. She had to go. She said her work here was finished. When did she tell you that? She didn't tell us, said Jessica Park, another group member. We just knew. The same way we always knew what she was thinking during our sessions. You could hear her thoughts? Not hear them, Marcus explained. Feel them. She understood our pain without us having to explain it. She carried our sadness so we didn't have to carry it alone. Amy Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen, nodded in agreement. She was like us. Someone who died but didn't leave completely. Someone who stayed behind to help. The room fell silent as the implications hit me. These 6 patients, all victims of severe trauma, all struggling with thoughts of suicide, all feeling isolated and misunderstood, had been receiving therapy from someone who understood their pain because she'd experienced the ultimate trauma herself. She saved us, Marcus said quietly, by showing us that death isn't the end of caring, that people can continue loving and helping even after they're gone. I looked at the empty chair where Dr. Chen had sat for 3 weeks, providing silent therapy that had achieved more breakthroughs than months of traditional treatment. The patients were right. She'd saved them by demonstrating that connection, compassion, and healing could persist beyond physical death. Her personnel file remained empty, but her impact was documented in the remarkable recovery of 6 adolescents who'd been considered untreatable. Sometimes the most effective therapy comes not from what we say, but from what we're willing to carry for others. Even when carrying that burden requires us to remain present in ways that transcend the boundaries between life and death. The empty chair stays in our group therapy room now, not as a memorial, but as a reminder that healing can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most profound therapeutic presence is the one that exists in the spaces between words, between worlds, between what we can see and what we know to be true. The email arrived at 6:23 a.m. on a Monday that already felt cursed. Dr. Jennifer Burke, please report to administration immediately regarding reassignment of Dr. Patricia Vance's active caseload. Dr. Vance had resigned over the weekend, citing personal emergency and providing no forwarding contact information. After 12 years at Millbrook, she'd simply cleaned out her office and disappeared, leaving behind 4 active patient files and a therapy room that maintenance claimed had unusual wear patterns on the furniture. I found Administrator Hendricks in his office, surrounded by paperwork and wearing the expression of someone who'd been dealing with personnel crises since dawn. "Dr. Burke, thank you for coming in early. We need to redistribute Patricia's cases immediately. The patients are expecting their regular appointments today." He handed me 4 manila folders. "These are her most challenging cases. Adolescents with severe trauma histories. Patricia specifically requested that they be assigned to you if anything happened to her." She requested me specifically. "Last month, she updated her personnel file with instructions for case transfer. Said you were the only counselor with the right temperament for these particular patients." I opened the first file. Patient LM, age 16, admitted 6 months ago for severe depression and self-harm behaviors. But the personal information section was completely blank. No full name, no family contacts, no admission notes beyond basic demographics. The second file, patient RT, age 17, trauma-related dissociation. Again, no substantial information beyond initials and age. All 4 files were the same. Skeletal documentation that revealed nothing about the patient's actual histories or therapeutic needs. "Mr. Hendricks, these files are incomplete. I need full case histories to provide appropriate treatment. Patricia said you'd understand once you met with them." She was unconventional in her documentation methods. An hour later, I unlocked Patricia's former office, now mine, and prepared for my first appointment. The room felt strange, as if the air itself held residual tension from previous sessions. The therapy table between the 2 chairs caught my attention immediately. Carved into the wooden surface were 4 sets of initials, LM, RT, KS. And DB, the letters were deep, deliberate, as if someone had spent considerable time etching them into the wood. At exactly 9 a.m., there was a knock on my door. "Come in." No one entered. The hallway was empty when I checked, but I found a note slipped under the door. "LM, session beginning. Please sit down." I returned to my chair, feeling increasingly unsettled. The room was empty, but the carved initials LM on the table seemed darker than they'd been moments before. "LM, are you here?" The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The carved letters grew darker still, as if someone were tracing them with invisible ink. A voice came from nowhere and everywhere. "Dr. Vance said you'd be able to help us." I spun around, looking for the source. The voice sounded young, female, desperately tired. "Where are you, LM?" "Same place I've always been. Same place Dr. Vance found us 6 months ago." I sat down, trying to maintain professional composure despite the impossible situation. "Can you tell me what kind of help you need?" "We need someone to remember us. Dr. Vance was good at that, but it was too much for her. She couldn't carry all of us anymore." "Carry you where?" "In her mind, in her dreams, in the spaces between therapy sessions where trauma lives." The carved initials LM were now completely black, standing out against the wood like a burn mark. "LM, I need you to help me understand." "Are you a patient who was treated here?" "We were patients who died here. Suicide, overdose, car accident, leaving the facility. Dr. Vance found us after we passed. Our trauma was so intense it left impressions, like fingerprints on the therapy room." My hands were shaking as I took notes. "What did Dr. Vance do for you?" "She listened. She carried our pain so we didn't have to carry it alone anymore. But trauma is heavy, Dr. Burke. It wears down the people who try to heal it." The room grew colder. The other sets of initials, RT, KS, DB, began darkening as well. "We're all here," said a different voice, older and male. "RT-17 killed myself in the parking lot after a session where I couldn't explain what my stepfather did to me." "KS," came a third voice, younger and fragile. "Overdosed on the medication that was supposed to help with the nightmares. Turns out the nightmares were memories." "DB," said the fourth voice, barely a whisper. "Car accident on the way home from group therapy. I was texting my mom that I finally felt hope for the first time in months." I stared at the therapy table, all 4 sets of initials now black as coal against the pale wood. "What do you need from me?" "Same thing we needed from Dr. Vance," LM said. "Someone to remember that we existed, that our pain mattered, that we were more than just trauma statistics." "Dr. Vance carried you for 12 years? 6 months, RT corrected. But it felt like 12 years to her. Trauma time moves differently. Every session with us, she experienced our entire histories. The abuse, the neglect, the moments when we decided death was better than continuing. That's why she left. That's why she couldn't stay," KS said sadly. Our trauma was consuming her dreams, her peace, her ability to help living patients. She was becoming hollow, carved out by all the pain she was carrying for us. I understood now why the files contained so little information. The patient's trauma was too intense to document traditionally. It had to be carried emotionally, personally, in ways that left marks on the people who tried to help. What happens if I can't do this?
You'll find someone else, DB said.
Eventually. But Dr. Burke, there's something else you should know.
What?
This doesn't end with just carrying our trauma. When you take on this much pain, when you let it live inside you, it changes you. Part of you starts to understand why we made the choices we made. I looked down at the therapy table. Beside the 4 black sets of initials, new letters were forming, pale at first, then darker. "Jibby, my initials, Dr. Burke," LM said gently. "Dr. Vance wanted us to tell you, the trauma we carry is contagious. It spreads to the people who try to heal it. The more you help us, the more you'll understand our pain. And understanding trauma this deep, it's dangerous." I touched the carved letters of my own initials, feeling the grooves that hadn't been there an hour ago. What happened to the counselors before Dr. Vance? "They found their own ways to stop carrying the pain," RT said quietly. I spent the rest of the day with the 4 voices, learning their stories, feeling their trauma settle into my mind like sediment in still water. By evening, I understood why Dr. Vance had left so suddenly, and why she'd chosen me specifically, someone young enough to believe I could handle anything, naive enough to think professional training could protect me from the kind of pain that leaves permanent marks. The carved initials are all dark now, including mine. Each day I carry a little more of their trauma, and each night I understand a little better why they chose to leave. But someone has to remember them. Someone has to hold their pain so it doesn't disappear entirely. I just hope I can find my replacement before I understand their final decisions too completely. The blood was still fresh on the intake form when Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell walked into my office that first Tuesday morning in October. She'd cut her finger signing the paperwork, she explained apologetically, pressing a tissue to the small wound. The droplets had fallen in a pattern across her signature that looked unsettlingly like tears. Eleanor was 68, recently widowed, seeking grief counseling after her husband's death from pancreatic cancer. Standard case, the kind I'd handled dozens of times during my 8 years specializing in bereavement therapy. She seemed composed, articulate, dressed in the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades as a professor's wife. "Dr. Margaret Collins," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I hope you can help me learn to live without Harold." We began with standard protocols: assessment of her support system, exploration of the relationship dynamics, evaluation of her coping mechanisms. Eleanor had lost her husband of 43 years just 6 weeks earlier. They'd had no children, few close friends, a life that had revolved entirely around each other. "We did everything together," she explained during our second session. "Grocery shopping, reading, even our research projects. Harold was a historian, and I helped with his manuscripts. We were never apart for more than a few hours. Her grief was profound but seemed manageable. She attended sessions regularly, completed therapeutic exercises, showed gradual signs of accepting her loss after 2 months of weekly meetings. We'd established a solid therapeutic relationship based on structured empathy and predictable progression through the stages of grief. Then she made an unusual request. "Dr. Collins, I'd like to schedule one final session, a kind of closure meeting." "That sounds appropriate, Eleanor. When would work best for you?" "Midnight. This Friday?" "I know it's unusual, but Harold always said his thinking was clearest at midnight. I believe he might join us." Every therapeutic protocol I'd learned warned against accommodating delusions or encouraging magical thinking in grief counseling. But Eleanor had made such remarkable progress, and she was scheduled to conclude treatment anyway. "Eleanor, when you say Harold might join us, what exactly do you mean?" "I mean he might attend our session. He promised he would find a way to say goodbye properly." Red flags should have been going off. Grief hallucinations, denial, possible psychotic features requiring psychiatric referral. But Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, her demeanor entirely rational except for this single belief. "Mrs. Hartwell, grief can sometimes make us feel very connected to people we've lost." "Dr. Collins," she interrupted gently, "I understand you're concerned about my mental state, but I'm not having hallucinations or delusions. I'm asking for one final session because Harold and I have unfinished business that requires professional mediation. Something in her voice made me reconsider. Eleanor had demonstrated exceptional insight throughout our work together. Her request was unusual, but not necessarily pathological. "All right," I said against my better judgment. "Midnight this Friday. But I'll need to document this as an experimental therapeutic intervention." Friday night, I arrived at the office at 11:45 p.m., questioning my decision. The Millbrook building felt different at midnight, larger somehow, with corridors that seemed to stretch longer than during daylight hours. My footsteps echoed strangely as I walked to my office, as if the sound were bouncing off walls that had shifted positions. Eleanor was already waiting in the hallway, dressed in her usual careful manner, but carrying a small suitcase I hadn't seen before. "Thank you for accommodating this request. Dr. Collins, it means more than you know." We entered my office, and I immediately noticed the temperature difference. The room felt at least 10 degrees colder than the hallway, despite the heating system running normally. Eleanor took her usual chair, but she'd also arranged a third chair beside her. "Harold's chair," she explained. "I noted this in my session log as symbolic representation of deceased spouse." At exactly midnight, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air became heavier, more dense, as if the space were filling with something invisible but substantial. The third chair creaked softly, the sound of furniture settling under weight. Eleanor's entire demeanor transformed. Her face relaxed into an expression of profound relief and joy, her eyes focusing on the empty chair beside her. "Harold," she said, her voice warm with recognition. "You made it." I watched her carefully, documenting what appeared to be a therapeutic conversation with her internalized representation of her deceased husband. Grief counseling often involved these kinds of symbolic dialogues. But then Eleanor turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion or delusion, but clarity so sharp it was almost frightening. "Dr. Collins, Harold wants to know why you're pretending not to see him." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Eleanor, I'm not pretending anything. I'm observing your therapeutic process. He says you've been able to see deceased spouses for years. That's why you specialize in grief counseling, because you can actually facilitate real conversations between the living and the dead." My hands were trembling as I took notes. This was clearly a projection, Eleanor attributing supernatural abilities to me as a way of validating her own need to maintain connection with Harold. But the empty chair creaked again, and I could swear I felt someone's gaze on me, patient, knowing, slightly amused. "Harold says to tell you about Margaret," Eleanor continued, "your sister who died when you were 12. He says she's the one who guided you into this profession." The pen slipped from my fingers. "Margaret had been my twin sister, killed in a car accident when we were children. I'd never mentioned her to any patient, never discussed how her death had influenced my career choice. The connection between my sister's name and my own professional focus on grief was something I'd never consciously acknowledged." "Eleanor, how do you know about Margaret?" "I don't," she said simply. "Harold does. He says she's here too, standing behind your chair. She's proud of the work you've been doing." The room felt suddenly crowded, as if populated by invisible observers. I could sense presence, multiple presences watching our session with interest and approval. "Harold wants to explain something," Eleanor continued. "He says some therapists are chosen specifically for this work. People who've experienced profound loss at a young age, who've developed the ability to perceive connections that persist beyond death." I was writing frantically, trying to document what was happening while struggling to maintain professional objectivity, but my hands were shaking too badly to form coherent notes. "He says you've been facilitating these conversations for years without realizing it. Every breakthrough in grief counseling, every moment when a patient suddenly found peace, those weren't just psychological processes. Those were actual communications with deceased loved ones, mediated through your natural sensitivity." The recording equipment I'd set up captured everything, but I knew it would show only Eleanor's voice speaking to empty air. The profound presence I felt in the room, the sense of multiple consciousnesses engaged in therapeutic dialogue, would be invisible to technology. "What does Harold want from this session?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Eleanor smiled, but she was looking through me rather than at me, as if Harold were standing directly behind my chair. "He wants to thank you for helping me accept his death. But more than that, he wants you to understand your own gift. He says there are other counselors like you, people who can bridge the gap between the living and the dead, but most of them don't recognize their abilities. The chair creaked more substantially now, and I felt a definite temperature change around my shoulders, as if someone were leaning over me. "Margaret wants you to know she never left," Eleanor said, her voice growing softer. "She says she's been present during all your grief counseling sessions, helping you understand what the bereaved need to hear." Tears were streaming down my face now, both from the impossible comfort of believing my sister was present, and from the professional crisis of accepting something that contradicted everything I'd been trained to believe about therapeutic practice. "Harold says this session was designed to help you understand your calling," Eleanor continued. "You're not just a grief counselor. You're a medium for healing conversations between worlds." The session continued for another hour, with Eleanor facilitating what appeared to be a complex dialogue between multiple deceased individuals and my professional skepticism. Harold provided insights about grief that went far beyond anything in the therapeutic literature. Margaret offered comfort about losses I'd never fully processed. Other voices joined the conversation, former patients' deceased loved ones, expressing gratitude for communications I'd unknowingly facilitated, explaining how my grief counseling had allowed them to provide closure they couldn't offer during life. As the clock approached 2 a.m., Eleanor's demeanor began shifting back to her normal presentation. "Harold says he has to go now," she said, tears flowing freely. "But he wanted me to tell you, this was our final session, but not your final session. You have a gift that many people need." She turned to me directly, her eyes clear and focused. "Dr. Collins, you can stop pretending to be just a counselor now. You're something much more important." The heaviness in the air began to dissipate. The extra chair stopped creaking. The temperature gradually returned to normal. Eleanor gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. "Dr. Collins, our therapeutic relationship is complete. Harold and I have found the peace we needed. But I suspect you'll be having many more midnight sessions with other patients who need to communicate with people they've lost." After she left, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the recording of our session. It captured only Eleanor's voice, speaking to empty air, but the insights she'd shared were therapeutically sophisticated, beyond anything I'd encountered in professional literature. Over the following weeks, I began noticing things I'd previously dismissed. Patients who spoke to empty chairs during grief counseling often showed breakthrough progress that couldn't be explained by conventional therapeutic methods. Bereaved individuals frequently left sessions with specific information about their deceased loved ones that they couldn't have known. I started accepting more midnight appointments, allowing grieving patients to create the environmental conditions they felt would facilitate connection with the dead. The results were consistently remarkable, healing that went far beyond what traditional grief counseling could achieve. Eleanor was right. I'd been facilitating communications between the living and the dead for years without recognizing it. My specialization in grief counseling hadn't been just professional choice. It had been a calling to use abilities I'd inherited from my own childhood encounter with death. Some therapeutic relationships, I've learned, require 3 participants: the living patient, the professional counselor, and the deceased loved one who still has something important to say. The midnight sessions continue, and the healing they provide extends far beyond what any textbook could explain. The Neuralink therapeutic interface arrived at Millbrook on a Tuesday morning in March, shipped in cases marked with biohazard symbols and confidentiality warnings. Dr. Hendricks had been excited about the pilot program for months, cutting-edge technology that promised to revolutionize adolescent psychiatric treatment through direct neural connection between counselor and patient. "Dr. Sarah Kim," he said, watching technicians install the equipment in our newest therapy room, "you've been selected to lead the beta testing. Your background in cognitive behavioral therapy makes you ideal for this type of innovative intervention." The system looked like something from a science fiction film. 2 reclining chairs connected to a central processing unit, each equipped with a headset containing dozens of electrodes designed to monitor and synchronize brainwave patterns. The theory was elegant. By linking counselor and patient neural activity, the system could create shared therapeutic experiences that were impossible through traditional talk therapy. The patient experiences a safe, controlled environment where they can confront traumatic memories," the lead technician explained. Meanwhile, the counselor experiences the same virtual scenario, providing real-time support and guidance. It's like being inside the patient's mind, helping them rewrite their emotional responses to traumatic events. My first test subject was Alex Morrison, a 15-year-old boy who'd been struggling with severe PTSD following a house fire that killed his younger sister. Traditional therapy had been minimally effective. Alex's trauma was so overwhelming that he couldn't discuss the incident without complete psychological shutdown. The Neuralink bypasses verbal communication. I explained to Alex as we prepared for our first session. Instead of talking about the fire, we'll experience a safe, controlled version of it together. I'll be there with you, helping you process the memory without being overwhelmed. Alex nodded, his trust in me evident despite his usual reluctance to engage with therapeutic interventions. We settled into the chairs and the technicians attached the monitoring equipment. The headsets felt heavier than expected, and I could feel the subtle electrical tingle of the electrodes making contact with my scalp. Initiating synchronization, the technician announced. "Dr. Kim, you should begin experiencing Alex's mental environment in 3, 2, 1, the world dissolved. I found myself standing in a suburban house I'd never seen before, but every detail felt familiar. The blue carpet in the living room, the family photos on the mantelpiece, the smell of Alex's mother's vanilla candles. This was Alex's home, reconstructed from his memories with perfect fidelity. Alex appeared beside me, but he looked different, younger, more vulnerable, wearing pajamas instead of his usual defensive clothing. "This is where it happened," he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone reliving trauma. Emma was asleep upstairs. I could feel his fear as if it were my own, the way his heart rate accelerated, the cold sweat, the desperate urge to run. But I also felt my own therapeutic presence, calm and supportive, helping him process the experience safely. "We're going to go through this together," I told him. "But this time, you're not alone." The scenario unfolded gradually. We walked through the house as smoke began filtering down from the second floor. Alex's panic was overwhelming, but my presence in the shared space allowed him to stay grounded, to make decisions instead of freezing with terror. "I tried to get to Emma," he said, tears streaming down his face, "but the stairs were already on fire." "You did everything you could," I replied, and I could feel the words resonating in his mind, not just as external reassurance, but as internal truth. A 15-year-old boy cannot be expected to rescue someone from a burning building. For 40 minutes, we worked through the traumatic memory together, reprocessing Alex's guilt and fear within the safe structure of the shared virtual environment. It was the most effective therapeutic session I'd ever conducted. Alex was able to confront his trauma directly while feeling completely supported. Then something went wrong. Alex began to flicker in the virtual space, his image becoming transparent and unstable. His voice grew distant, as if he were speaking from far away. "Dr. Kim, I can't see you clearly anymore." I tried to respond, but my own voice sounded strange, echoing as if I were speaking from inside a tunnel. The virtual house around us began shifting, details changing randomly. Alex's bedroom became my childhood room. His family photos were replaced by pictures of my own family. "Alex, stay with me. Don't let the connection fade." But he was disappearing entirely now, fading like a ghost until I was alone in a space that was no longer his memory, but somehow my own. And then I heard my own voice, speaking words I wasn't thinking. "Dr. Kim, I'm scared. The fire is getting worse." I spun around looking for the source of the voice, but I was alone in the virtual space. Yet the voice continued, my voice, but speaking with Alex's cadence, his emotional patterns, his traumatic memories. I couldn't save Emma. I should have tried harder. The realization hit me like ice water. Alex had vanished from the interface, but his consciousness, his memories, his trauma had somehow transferred into my mind. I was experiencing his PTSD as if it were my own, generating responses from his perspective while maintaining my therapeutic awareness. "System malfunction," I tried to say, but my voice came out as Alex's. Why didn't I run upstairs? Why did I freeze? I was trapped in a therapeutic feedback loop, playing both patient and counselor in a scenario that had become dangerously unstable. My professional training was generating responses to Alex's trauma, but my mind was simultaneously processing that trauma as if I had experienced it personally. The virtual environment began collapsing, details fragmenting and reforming randomly. I tried to remove the headset manually, but my arms weren't responding to my conscious commands. The Neuralink system had taken over my motor functions, keeping me connected to the interface while the psychological merger continued. "Dr. Kim?" Alex's voice came through the speakers, but it was my voice speaking his words. "Something's wrong. I can't find myself in here." Minutes felt like hours as I struggled to separate my consciousness from Alex's traumatic memories. The house fire played over and over, but now I was experiencing it from multiple perspectives simultaneously. As Alex, the frightened boy, as Emma, the trapped sister, as the mother who discovered the tragedy, as myself, the therapist trying to provide healing. Eventually, the system shut down automatically. The virtual environment disappeared, and I found myself back in the therapy chair, covered in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. Alex was unconscious in the chair beside me, breathing steadily, but showing no signs of awareness. The central processing unit printed a single message on its attached printer. "Merged session complete. Host stable. Patient consciousness successfully integrated. Recommend immediate psychological evaluation for primary operator." The technicians were frantically checking readings, trying to understand what had happened. But I knew. The Neuralink system hadn't just allowed me to share Alex's therapeutic experience. It had somehow transferred his entire traumatic complex into my mind. Over the following days, I began experiencing Alex's PTSD symptoms as if they were my own. I had nightmares about a sister I'd never had, panic attacks triggered by the smell of smoke, survivor's guilt over a tragedy I'd never experienced. Alex's trauma had become indistinguishable from my own memories, but Alex himself showed remarkable improvement. His PTSD symptoms had virtually disappeared, as if the traumatic memories had been literally extracted from his mind and relocated elsewhere. "I feel so much better." "Dr. Kim," he said during our follow-up session, "it's like the weight of what happened has been lifted off me. I can remember the fire, but it doesn't hurt anymore." The Neuralink experiment was immediately discontinued, the equipment sealed and returned to the manufacturer with incident reports that would probably ensure the technology never reached clinical application. But I understood what had happened. The system had created a genuine therapeutic merger. Alex's trauma had been processed by transferring it to someone better equipped to handle it. I'd become a psychological repository for his pain, carrying his memories so he could heal. The integration was permanent. Alex's traumatic memories had become part of my own psychological landscape, but my professional training allowed me to process them as therapeutic material rather than personal trauma. I'd become a living example of what true empathy could accomplish, literally taking on a patient's suffering to facilitate their healing. Some therapeutic relationships, I learned, require more than emotional support. Sometimes healing demands that someone carry the patient's pain forward, transforming trauma through professional understanding until it becomes bearable, manageable, and ultimately transformative for both the original sufferer and the one who chooses to share the burden. I heard the screaming before I saw her chart. Margaret Hollis, 34, found wandering Interstate 95 at 3 a.m, claiming someone was chasing her through time itself. But when she walked into my office that first Tuesday, there was no trace of the hysteria described in the intake notes. She moved with deliberate calm, took the chair across from my desk without invitation, and stared at me with the focused attention of someone waiting for a familiar routine to begin. "Margaret?" I opened her file, pen ready. "I'm Dr. Brennan. We have an hour together." Nothing. She blinked once, slowly, like someone surfacing from deep water. Her breathing was controlled, rhythmic, almost meditative. I'd seen catatonic states before, trauma responses, medication fog, but this felt different. Her silence had purpose. I tried standard approaches, open-ended questions, reflective listening, comfortable pauses. She remained perfectly still, her gaze never wavering from my face. After 20 minutes, I began to feel like a specimen under observation. Her eyes tracked my movements with clinical precision. "Can you tell me why you're here, Margaret?" She tilted her head slightly, studying me with what looked like disappointment. "Would you like to write something down instead?" Still nothing. But her expression shifted, became almost pitying, as if I were failing some test I didn't know I was taking. This pattern continued for 3 weeks. Margaret would arrive precisely at 9 a.m., take the same chair, and watch me work. I documented each session. Patient, non-responsive. Maintains eye contact but refuses verbal engagement. Recommend continued observation. My supervisor suggested different strategies: art therapy, written exercises, medication review. Nothing changed. Margaret simply watched, waited, and somehow made me feel increasingly inadequate. Then, on a Thursday morning in late October, she spoke. "Your questions were better last time." I looked up from my notes, startled by the normalcy of her voice. "I'm sorry?" "Last time," she repeated, her tone matter of fact. "You asked about my childhood, about the car accident with my sister. You seemed more prepared then." I flipped through her file. 3 weeks of documented silence, nothing about any sister or accident. "Margaret, this is only our 4th meeting. We haven't discussed your family." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Dr. Brennan, you spent 20 minutes on my relationship with Angela during our 2nd session. You were worried about my guilt responses. You took very detailed notes." My pen felt suddenly heavy. Angela wasn't mentioned anywhere in Margaret's intake paperwork. Her emergency contact was listed as none available. "You also told me about your own sister," Margaret continued. "About the drowning incident when you were 12. How it influenced your choice to become a therapist." The blood drained from my face. I'd never told any patient about Sarah, about watching her slip under the waves during our family vacation, about the guilt that had shaped my entire career. That memory was locked away, mentioned only in my own therapy sessions years ago. "I think there's been some confusion. You asked if I'd ever felt responsible for someone else's death," she said. "You seemed to understand when I told you about the steering wheel, how I could have grabbed it, how 1 second of action might have saved her." I closed Margaret's file with shaking hands. "Margaret, I need to review our previous sessions. Can we continue this tomorrow?" She smiled then, the first genuine expression I'd seen cross her face. "Of course, Dr. Brennan. Same time, same questions." Like always. That evening I stayed late, searching for any record of the sessions Margaret described. My appointment calendar showed only our weekly Thursday meetings. The computer system had no additional entries. Margaret's file contained only my sparse notes about her non-responsiveness. But when I arrived the next morning, there was a new document in her folder. A detailed session summary, dated for today's appointment, signed in handwriting that looked disturbingly like mine. It described an hour-long conversation about sibling trauma, survivor guilt, and therapeutic breakthrough moments. The insights were sophisticated, professional. Exactly the kind of notes I would write after a successful session. Margaret was already waiting in my office when I arrived. "You look tired," she said with genuine concern. "The late nights are catching up with you, just like they did with Dr. Patterson." Dr. Patterson, my predecessor, the counselor who'd left abruptly 6 months ago. I'd inherited his caseload, his office, even his coffee maker. "What about Dr. Patterson?" "He went through the same confusion you're experiencing now," Margaret said gently. The gap between what he remembered and what the files showed. He tried to fight it at first, demanded explanations, threatened to report irregularities. My mouth felt dry. "What happened to him?" "Same thing that's happening to you." The sessions started blending together. Past appointments, future conversations, memories that felt real but had no documentation. She paused, watching my expression. Eventually, he stopped questioning the files, started trusting the process. I grabbed Margaret's folder, flipping through pages that seemed thicker than they'd been yesterday. Session notes filled the file, dozens of them, all in my handwriting, describing months of therapy I had no memory of conducting. Detailed treatment plans, medication adjustments, family history I'd never collected. The dates progressed chronologically, some reaching into next month. Tomorrow's session was already documented, complete with Margaret's projected responses and my planned interventions. "How is this possible?" Margaret stood up, smoothing her skirt with practiced efficiency. "Some patients don't come for healing, Dr. Brennan. Some of us come for continuity." Dr. Patterson understood that eventually. "The files know what happened, even when we don't." She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "Same time tomorrow. You'll ask about my dreams this time, about the recurring images of Angela calling for help." After she left, I sat alone, staring at her file. My afternoon was clear. No appointments scheduled until 2 p.m. But there was already a detailed note for today's 11 a.m. session, written in my handwriting, describing Margaret's breakthrough regarding repressed memories and family dynamics. I looked at my watch. 10:55 a.m. At exactly 11 a.m., someone knocked on my door. The files continue updating themselves now. Sessions scheduled months in advance, all bearing my signature and professional observations. Margaret comes at different times throughout the week, though my calendar only shows our original Thursday appointments. Sometimes she asks about my adjustment to the routine, whether I'm sleeping better since I stopped fighting the documentation. I've learned not to question the notes. Like Dr. Patterson before me, I've accepted that some therapeutic relationships exist outside normal time constraints. The only thing that bothers me now is the new counselor they've hired to replace Dr. Patterson's remaining cases. She's young, enthusiastic, confident in her training. Yesterday I heard her questioning discrepancies in her files, demanding explanations for session notes she didn't remember writing. Some records I've discovered write themselves, and some patients have been waiting much longer than their intake dates suggest, ready to teach each new counselor the same essential lesson about the nature of therapeutic continuity. The blizzard hit without warning, turning Tuesday evening into chaos. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and our intake desk was processing walk-ins with whatever staff remained after the early dismissals. That's how David Kellner ended up. In my office at 11 p.m., brought in by police who'd found him wandering downtown in the storm. No identification, no insurance information, no emergency contacts. Just a middle-aged man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of stillness that suggested either heavy medication or profound dissociation. The intake form was nearly blank. Estimated age 45, possible head injury, requires psychiatric evaluation before placement. When I introduced myself, he looked up with startling clarity. "You used to help me," he said before I'd even opened his file. I settled into my chair, pen ready. "I'm Dr. Morrison. We haven't met before, David. Can you tell me your full name?" "David Anthony Kellner." "And yes, we have met. You helped me work through the panic attacks after my mother's funeral. This was in your old office, the one with the blue carpet and the plant that kept dying." My pen stopped moving. I'd had an office with blue carpet, but that was at my previous position in Sacramento 3 years ago. And I had worked with a David Kellner there, a college student struggling with grief-related anxiety after losing his mother unexpectedly. But that patient had been 22 years old. This man was easily twice that age. "David, I think you might be confusing me with someone else. Can you tell me how you got here tonight?" He smiled with genuine warmth, the expression transforming his entire face. "Dr. Morrison, you always did this when patients made connections you couldn't immediately verify. You did the same thing with Jennifer Walsh when she told you the breathing exercises were helping her sleep." Jennifer Walsh. I'd treated her 4 years ago during my residency rotation in Portland. She'd suffered from severe insomnia following a car accident, and we'd worked extensively on anxiety management techniques. I'd never mentioned her name to anyone at this facility. "How do you know about Jennifer?" "Same way I know about Marcus Rivera, the teenager who wouldn't talk about his father's drinking until you suggested he write letters instead of speaking out loud. Same way I know about Eleanor Fitzgerald, the elderly woman who thought she was losing her mind until you helped her understand that grief can feel like hallucinations." My hands began to tremble. "Marcus Rivera, from my internship in Phoenix 5 years ago. Eleanor Fitzgerald, one of my first successful cases during fellowship training in Denver 7 years ago. These were patients spanning my entire career, across multiple states, cases I'd never discussed with colleagues or supervisors. David, I need you to explain how you know these names." "Because you helped all of us," he said simply. "Marcus writes poetry now instead of drinking. Jennifer finished law school last year. Eleanor lived 2 more peaceful years before she passed." I set down my pen and studied his face carefully. The David Kellner I'd treated in Sacramento had been a lanky college student with dark hair and nervous energy. This man bore no physical resemblance to that young patient, but he knew details that weren't in any file. Private moments, breakthrough conversations, therapeutic insights I'd never documented in official records. The night you stayed late to help me understand that my mother's death wasn't a punishment for our last argument, David continued. You missed your nephew's birthday party. You felt guilty about it for weeks. The room felt suddenly airless. My nephew Tyler's 7th birthday. I'd promised to be there, but David's crisis session had run long, and by the time we'd worked through his guilt complex, the party was over. I'd never told any patient about my personal commitments or family obligations. How could you possibly know that? Because you told me, David said. Not in words, but I could see it in how you checked your phone, how you kept glancing at the clock but refused to cut our session short. You cared enough to help me through the worst night of my therapy, even though it cost you personally. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the parking lot in pristine white that seemed to muffle all sound from the outside world. This isn't possible. You're not the same person I treated. That David Kellner would be 25 now, not middle-aged. Time works differently for some of us, he said quietly. When you truly help someone heal, part of your work stays with them forever, and part of them stays connected to you. Haven't you ever felt that, Dr. Morrison? The sense that your former patients are still with you somehow? I had felt that. The phantom presence of past successes, moments when I'd reach for therapeutic, techniques that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my training, strategies that felt like echoes of previous breakthroughs. What happened to the files? I asked suddenly. David looked genuinely confused. What files? The case records. Jennifer's, Marcus's, Eleanor's. They're all gone from the central database. I tried to access them last month for a research project on long-term treatment outcomes. Every file from my previous positions has vanished. Maybe they weren't meant to be stored that way, David suggested. Maybe the real records are kept somewhere else. That night, I couldn't sleep. I called my former supervisor in Sacramento, Dr. Robert Chen, now semi-retired, but still accessible. Robert, this might sound strange, but do you remember a patient named David Kellner from about 3 years ago? A long pause. David, are you feeling all right? You sound stressed. Do you remember him? There was no David Kellner in your caseload, he said carefully. I reviewed all your files when you transferred. Are you sure you have the right name? But I remembered those sessions vividly. The breakthrough moment when David realized his guilt was preventing him from processing his grief properly. The tears, when he finally accepted that his mother's death wasn't connected to their argument. I hung up and immediately called my fellowship supervisor in Denver. Eleanor Fitzgerald? No, David, you never treated anyone by that name. Your geriatric rotation focused exclusively on dementia cases. Phoenix, Portland, Sacramento. Every supervisor, every colleague I contacted gave me the same response. The patients David had mentioned, patients whose healing I remembered clearly, had never existed in any official record. But David knew them all. I found him the next morning in the common area, reading a magazine with the same patient calm he'd displayed during intake. They don't remember, I said without preamble. Who doesn't remember what? My supervisors, the patients you mentioned. None of them exist in any official database. David looked up from his magazine, his expression genuinely sympathetic. But you remember them? Yes. And they were real to you. Their pain was real. Their healing was real. Your connection with them mattered. Of course. Then what does it matter what the computers say? He folded the magazine carefully. Some people carry the stories of everyone they've truly helped. It's a rare gift, Dr. Morrison. Not many therapists create the kind of lasting impact that generates someone like me. I sat down across from him in the institutional furniture that suddenly felt less cold, less sterile. What are you exactly? I'm the living record of every patient you've successfully helped, David said. The part of them that remembers your compassion, your skill, your willingness to sacrifice personal time for their healing. I'm the gratitude they never got to express and the progress that continues long after therapy ends. And the missing files? The official files were never the real record. The real record is what stays with people, what changes them, what they carry forward into healthier lives. He smiled, and for a moment I could see traces of every patient I'd ever helped. You should be proud. Very few therapists create the kind of lasting therapeutic relationship that manifests as a living archive. David was discharged the following morning. No insurance company claimed responsibility, no family came forward, no social services placement was required. He simply walked out into the bright snow-covered morning, carrying a small bag of belongings that the staff swore hadn't existed when he arrived. I kept his file, the only case record that remained intact from my entire career. Sometimes I open it late at night, reading my sparse intake notes from that storm-darkened evening. But underneath my professional handwriting, in ink that seems to shift color in different light, are other notes. Thank you messages from patients whose names I remember but whose files have disappeared. The panic attack stopped after our last session. Thank you. DKI graduated law school thinking of our breathing exercises. JW, you helped me understand that grief isn't madness. EF, the real therapeutic record I've learned was never stored in filing systems or computer databases. It lives in the healing connections we create, the changes we witness, the parts of ourselves we invest in people who need them most. Some archives don't require maintenance or backup systems. They write themselves in the spaces between memory and gratitude, and occasionally they manifest as grateful patients who walk through your door on snowy nights to remind you that your work created something more permanent than any official documentation. The blood pooled slowly beneath Michael's chair as he carved another line into his forearm. But I was watching the empty seat to his left where someone invisible was whispering encouragement. The setup for group therapy had evolved over my 15 years at Millbrook Adolescent Treatment Center. 7 chairs arranged in a circle, 6 for patients, 1 for me. But early in my career, I'd learned that some teenagers found the enclosed feeling oppressive. So I added an 8th chair, always empty, positioned where troubled kids could focus if direct eye contact became too overwhelming. That extra chair had been my small innovation, a psychological pressure valve that gave anxious patients somewhere safe to look. Most counselors removed unused furniture, but I'd noticed that the empty space seemed to help. Patients would glance at it during difficult moments, as if drawing strength from the possibility of escape. For 14 years, it worked perfectly. The change began 3 months ago during a particularly challenging session with my Tuesday group. 6 teenagers dealing with severe depression, self-harm behaviors, and suicidal ideation. Michael Santos, 17, had been describing his latest episode when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at the empty chair. "She's right," he said. I never thought about it that way. I followed his gaze. The chair sat empty exactly where I'd placed it that morning. "Who's right, Michael?" "The lady in the blue dress." She asked why I thought my feelings were more important than my sister's. The other patients turned to look at the empty chair. Jessica Park, 16, nodded slowly. "She has a point. When you hurt yourself, it hurts everyone who cares about you." "What lady?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "The one sitting right there," Marcus Williams said, gesturing toward the empty chair. "She's been asking questions this whole time." Good questions. I saw nothing but empty space. But all 6 patients were staring at the chair with expressions of focused attention, as if engaged in active conversation with an invisible participant. "Can you describe what she looks like?" "Older, maybe 50, Jessica said. "Gray hair in a bun. She's wearing a blue dress with little flowers on it. She seems kind," added Amy Chen, who rarely spoke during group sessions. "Her voice is gentle, like she really understands." I made notes documenting what appeared to be a shared hallucination. Group psychosis was rare but not impossible, especially among teenagers with severe mental health issues. But the patients seemed calmer, more engaged than they'd been in weeks. The session continued, with my patients periodically turning to address the empty chair, responding to questions I couldn't hear, nodding at guidance I couldn't access. By the time we ended, they seemed more grounded, more hopeful than I'd seen them since admission. That evening, I reviewed the audio recording of the session. Group therapy sessions were always recorded for supervision and documentation purposes. I fast-forwarded to the moment when Michael first addressed the empty chair, expecting to hear only his voice. Instead, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Underneath the patients' voices, barely audible but unmistakably present, was another voice, elderly, female. asking gentle questions about coping strategies and family relationships. The voice was asking exactly the kinds of questions I would have asked, but with a wisdom and patience that seemed to come from decades of experience. "Michael," the faint voice was saying, "when did you first learn that pain was something you could control?" I rewound the recording multiple times. The voice was there, consistent, participating in therapeutic dialogue with professional skill. But the chair had been empty. I'd been watching it throughout the entire session. The following Tuesday, the same thing happened. All 6 patients immediately acknowledged the presence in the empty chair, engaging in complex therapeutic discussions with someone I couldn't see. This time, I positioned myself to watch the chair more carefully, looking for any sign of what the patients were experiencing. The chair remained empty, but I began to notice other things. The slight depression in the cushion, as if supporting weight. The way dust motes seemed to swirl around the space, as if disturbed by breathing. The temperature differential. The area around the empty chair was noticeably cooler than the rest of the room. "Dr. Peterson," Amy said during a particularly emotional moment, "she wants to know if you can hear her too." Dr. Peterson. The name hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Margaret Peterson had been my predecessor, the counselor who'd developed many of the group therapy protocols I still used. She'd worked at Millbrook for 30 years before retiring 5 years ago. She died 6 months ago of cancer, alone in hospice care. "Amy, did she tell you her name was Dr. Peterson?" "She says you know who she is," Amy replied. "She says she's been watching your work, and she's proud of how you've continued her methods." I left the session shaken, immediately accessing Dr. Peterson's personnel file. The photograph showed a woman in her 70s with gray hair typically worn in a neat bun. She favored conservative dresses in muted colors, exactly matching the patient's descriptions. More disturbing was what I found in her office inventory. Among the items cataloged after her retirement was a blue dress with small floral patterns, donated to charity along with her other professional wardrobe. That night, I stayed late to review every group therapy recording from the past 3 months. In each session, the faint voice was present, asking insightful questions, offering gentle guidance, participating in therapeutic dialogue with professional expertise. The voice was strongest during moments of crisis, when patients were struggling with particularly difficult revelations. I researched shared hallucinations, group psychosis, environmental factors that might explain what the patients were experiencing. But every explanation fell short of the reality. 6 different teenagers, with no history of psychotic episodes, were all seeing and hearing the same invisible counselor. The breakthrough came during the 4th week. Jessica was describing a suicide attempt when she suddenly turned to the empty chair with tears in her eyes. "You were there," she whispered, "in the hospital. You held my hand when my parents were too scared to touch me." I checked Jessica's admission records. She'd been hospitalized 2 years ago following an overdose, 6 months before Dr. Peterson's death. But according to the records, Dr. Peterson had indeed visited Jessica during her hospital stay, spending several hours at her bedside when the family was too overwhelmed to provide support. "She remembers all of us," Michael said quietly. "Every kid she ever helped. She says that's what happens when you really care about people. Part of you stays connected to them forever." The recording equipment picked up the invisible voice more clearly that day. "The work doesn't end when we retire," it was saying. "True healing creates bonds that persist beyond physical presence. These children were part of my heart when I was alive, and they remain part of my heart now." I found myself addressing the empty chair directly. "Dr. Peterson, if you're here, I need to understand. Are you helping them heal?" The temperature around the chair dropped noticeably. The patients all turned to listen to something I couldn't quite hear. "She says healing isn't limited by death," Amy translated. "She says some therapists leave an imprint, a presence that continues the work. She's been watching over all her former patients, helping when they need it most." The sessions continued for another month, with Dr. Peterson's invisible presence providing guidance, comfort, and professional insight that complemented my own efforts. The patients showed remarkable improvement. Their depression lifted, self-harm behaviors decreased, and their capacity for hope expanded dramatically. Then, during our final session before several patients' discharge, the chair felt different. Warmer, less present. "She's leaving," Marcus said sadly. "She says we don't need her anymore. Where is she going?" I asked. Wherever counselors go when their work is finished, Jessica replied. She says there are other kids who need help, other places where healing has to continue. The faint voice on the recording spoke one final time. Dr. Martinez, you've learned what I hope to teach you. Some therapeutic relationships transcend physical boundaries. Love, properly applied, creates healing that persists indefinitely. The chair has been empty ever since, but I keep it in its place during group sessions. Not because I expect Dr. Peterson to return. Her work with these particular patients was complete. But because I've learned that healing creates invisible networks of support, connections that persist beyond death, and sometimes the most important therapeutic presence is the one that exists in the spaces between what we can see and what we know to be true. The recordings still pick up faint voices sometimes. Other counselors who've passed on but whose love for their patients created lasting imprints. The empty chair serves as a reminder that our work doesn't end when we clock out, retire, or even die. True therapeutic connection creates something permanent, something that continues healing long after the official sessions conclude. The cleaning crew had left coffee stains on my desk again, dark rings that interrupted the neat arrangement of case files I'd organized for evening review. It was past midnight, but staying late had become routine, a necessary ritual to process the emotional residue of 8 daily sessions with severely traumatized adolescents. I opened my laptop and began the familiar sequence. Patient files, progress notes, treatment modifications. Henderson James, response to EMDR therapy showing improvement. Martinez, Sophia, still resistant to discussing family trauma. Wilson, David, medication adjustment needed for anxiety management. Then I noticed a file I didn't recognize. Tucked between Wilson's folder and my desk calendar was a manila folder labeled Patient, Dr. Elizabeth Kane, status in progress. The handwriting looked like mine, but I had no memory of creating this file. More disturbing, Dr. Elizabeth Kane was my name. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. The intake form was standard Millbrook documentation, but the information made my stomach drop. Patient name, Dr. Elizabeth Kane. Age 34. Admission date, 6 months ago. Primary concerns: professional burnout, identity confusion, reality testing difficulties. 6 months ago was exactly when I'd started working extended hours, staying late to review cases, sleeping in my office more nights than not. The clinical notes were written in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing them. Patient presence with increasing difficulty distinguishing between professional and personal identity. Reports feeling like she's watching herself conduct therapy sessions. Sleep patterns severely disrupted. Patient claims to be working during hours when facility is closed. I read the line 3 times. I did feel like I was watching myself during sessions lately, as if observing from outside my own body. And I had been experiencing strange dreams about conducting therapy in empty buildings after midnight. Patient exhibits signs of dissociative episodes during which she believes she is treating other patients. These episodes are becoming more frequent and elaborate. Patient has created detailed files for imaginary clients and maintains complex therapeutic relationships with non-existent individuals. Non-existent individuals. I looked at the stack of files on my desk. Henderson, Martinez, Wilson. Real patients with real problems that I'd been treating for months. But as I opened Henderson's file to verify his existence, the pages inside contained only my own handwriting, repeated over and over. Dr. Elizabeth Kane needs help. Dr. Elizabeth Kane needs help. Dr. Elizabeth Kane needs help. Martinez's file was the same. Wilson's file was the same. Page after page of my own name, written in increasingly erratic script, as if I'd been trying to convince myself of something through repetition. I returned to my own file, hands shaking as I read the treatment notes. Patient's condition has deteriorated over the past month. She now spends entire nights in her office, conducting sessions with empty chairs. Security cameras show her talking animatedly to no one, taking notes on non-existent conversations, maintaining detailed treatment plans for patients who don't exist. Security cameras. I rushed to my computer and accessed the surveillance system, entering my staff password to review footage from the past week. The recording showed my office at various late-night hours. In every frame, I sat at my desk, leaning forward in animated conversation with empty chairs positioned across from me. I would ask questions, pause as if listening to responses, take detailed notes, and occasionally nod with therapeutic understanding, but the chairs were empty. I was conducting elaborate therapy sessions with no one. Patient has developed sophisticated defense mechanisms to avoid acknowledging her psychological crisis. She has constructed an alternate reality where she is a functional therapist treating multiple patients, rather than a patient herself requiring intensive intervention. I scrolled through more surveillance footage. Week after week of me talking to empty chairs, reviewing files that contained only repetitive writings of my own name, conducting intake interviews with invisible patients. The treatment plan in my file was detailed and professional. Recommend gradual reality testing interventions. Patient must be slowly guided to recognize her dissociative episodes and accept her patient status. Direct confrontation may result in complete psychological collapse. Medications, risperidone 2 mg twice daily. Patient believes these are vitamins. Lorazepam 1 milliliters as needed for anxiety during reality testing episodes. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the small pill organizer I'd been using for the past 6 months. The labels read vitamin D and calcium supplement, but now I recognize them as antipsychotic medication and anxiety management drugs. The progress notes continued. Patient occasionally demonstrates moments of insight, but quickly retreats into therapeutic fantasy when confronted with her actual status. Her professional training allows her to create remarkably sophisticated delusional systems. Session 47. Patient discovered her own file today. This may represent breakthrough opportunity or trigger complete defensive retreat. Scheduling immediate follow-up. I checked the timestamp on this entry, 12:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour ago. At the bottom of the file was an appointment card. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, follow-up appointment, 1:47 a.m., Office 3112B. Office 3112B was located in the patient wing of the facility. I'd never been there, but according to the appointment card, I was scheduled to be there in exactly 1 hour. I closed the file and looked around my office with new eyes. The diplomas on the wall. When had I last looked at them closely? The patient chairs I arranged each morning. When had I last seen actual patients sitting in them? My computer showed a calendar full of appointments, but now I noticed that every single session was scheduled with E. Kane in different time slots. My entire professional schedule was actually a complex arrangement of my own therapy appointments, disguised by my mind as patient meetings to make them psychologically tolerable. The door to my office opened, and a woman in medical scrubs entered. I recognized her as Dr. Sarah Martinez, the night shift psychiatrist, but I'd never spoken with her before. "Elizabeth," she said gently, "it's time for your 1:47 appointment." I looked at my watch, 1:45 a.m. "Dr. Martinez, I think there's been some confusion." "I'm staff, not a patient. I know this is difficult," she said, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to dealing with delusional patients. "But you've been a patient here for 6 months. The therapeutic role-playing has been part of your treatment, but we need to start addressing reality more directly." She gestured toward the door. "Your actual therapist is waiting in 312B. The office you've been using belongs to Dr. Patricia Wong, who's been on leave. We've been allowing you to use it as part of your therapy, but it's time to transition to more traditional treatment." I stood up slowly, legs unsteady beneath me. The stack of patient files on my desk looked different now, props in an elaborate therapeutic exercise, designed to give me a sense of purpose while I received treatment for whatever psychological crisis had brought me here. "What happened to me?" I asked. "Severe burnout led to a dissociative break," Dr. Martinez explained as we walked toward the patient wing. "You were found in your previous office conducting therapy sessions with empty chairs, convinced you were treating dozens of patients who didn't exist. Your family brought you here for treatment." My family. I tried to remember parents, siblings, friends who cared about my well-being. The memories felt distant, overshadowed by months of therapeutic fantasy. Office 312B was smaller than the space I'd been using. Furnished with standard patient furniture rather than professional decor, a woman sat behind a simple desk wearing civilian clothes rather than medical attire. "Hello, Elizabeth," she said. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Torres, your actual therapist. We've been meeting for 6 months, though you've experienced our sessions as various patient encounters in your role-playing office." I sat down in the patient chair, feeling its unfamiliar angles. All my patients, they weren't real. They were aspects of your own psychological material, Dr. Torres explained. James Henderson represented your relationship with your father. Sophia Martinez embodied your cultural identity struggles. David Wilson reflected your anxiety about professional failure. You created them to process your own trauma indirectly. The treatment plan she showed me was real, professional, focused on healing rather than maintaining therapeutic fantasies. The medications were accurately labeled, the appointments honestly scheduled, the progress notes written from the perspective of treating a patient rather than pretending to be a therapist. Am I ready to be a real patient now? I asked. You've been a real patient all along, Dr. Torres said gently. Now you're ready to accept it, which means we can finally begin helping you heal. The self-therapy file had been my mind's last attempt to maintain professional identity while receiving the help I desperately needed. But sometimes the most sophisticated defense against psychological crisis is the illusion that you're qualified to cure it yourself. The memo appeared on my desk Tuesday morning, typed on official Millbrook letterhead but unsigned. Dr. Patricia Walsh, room 304, has been cleared for therapeutic use. Please resume standard scheduling. Administration. I stared at the notice, my coffee growing cold. Room 304 had been off limits for 8 months, ever since the acoustic incident that no one would discuss in detail. The other counselors spoke about it in hushed tones, equipment malfunctions, disturbing sound phenomena, something about voices that shouldn't have been possible, but we were short on space. And I had a new patient arriving that afternoon. Emma Rodriguez, 16, admitted after a severe dissociative episode following her grandmother's death. Standard grief counseling, nothing that should require special facilities. Room 304 was located at the end of the East Wing, separated from the other therapy rooms by a stretch of corridor that felt longer than it actually was. The door looked normal, standard institutional wood with a small window and the usual placard. But when I unlocked it, the air inside felt different. Heavier somehow, as if saturated with conversations that had never quite ended. The room was furnished like any other therapy space. 2 chairs, a small table, a box of tissues, basic recording equipment mounted discreetly in the corner. The walls were painted the same calming blue as every other counseling room in the facility. Nothing obviously wrong or unusual. But as I arranged the chairs, I noticed the intercom speaker mounted near the ceiling. Standard equipment for emergency communication, but this one looked older than the others, with a design I didn't recognize. The grill was tarnished, and there were scratches around the edges, as if someone had tried to remove it. Emma arrived precisely on time, a slight girl with dark circles under her eyes and the careful movements of someone who'd learned not to trust her own perceptions. She took the offered chair without comment, folding her hands in her lap with practiced precision. Emma, I'm Dr. Walsh. I understand you've been having some difficult experiences since your grandmother passed. She nodded, her voice barely audible. Abuela raised me after my parents died. She was the only family I had left. Tell me about the last time you saw her. She was in the hospital. Cancer. I was holding her hand when she... Emma's voice trailed off, tears starting to form. Right before she died, she squeezed my hand and said, I'll always be listening for you, mija, always. We talked for 20 minutes about grief, about the disorienting experience of losing the last connection to family, about the dissociative episodes Emma had been experiencing since the funeral. Standard therapeutic territory, nothing unusual or concerning. Then the intercom crackled to life. At first it was just static, the kind of background noise that old equipment sometimes generated. But as Emma continued talking about her grandmother's final words, the static began to resolve into something else. A voice. Elderly, female, speaking Spanish in a whisper so faint I almost missed it. Mija, estoy aquí. I'm still listening. Emma froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening with terror and recognition. Abuela? I looked at the intercom speaker, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Old buildings, crossed wires, radio interference, any number of explanations for what might have been coincidental sounds resembling speech. But the voice came again, clearer now. Don't be afraid, Emma. I told you I would always be listening. Emma burst into tears. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of desperate relief. Abuela, I miss you so much. I don't know how to live without you. You're stronger than you think, mija. You always were. I sat paralyzed, watching this impossible conversation unfold. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations, some kind of recording, a cruel prank, equipment malfunction. But the voice knew things. Emma's childhood nickname, specific phrases her grandmother had used, intimate details that couldn't have been fabricated. The session continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma pouring out her grief and fear while her grandmother's voice provided comfort through the intercom. It was the most effective grief counseling I'd ever witnessed, and I hadn't said a word. As our time ended, the elderly voice spoke one final time. I have to go now, mija. But remember, I'm always listening. The intercom fell silent. Emma looked at me with wonder and confusion. Dr. Walsh, did you hear that? Was that really my grandmother? I struggled for a professional response. Emma, grief can manifest in many ways. Sometimes we hear what we need to hear to begin healing. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, and left the session with more lightness in her step than I'd seen since her admission. I stayed in room 304 after Emma left, staring at the intercom speaker. Whatever had happened, it had been therapeutically beneficial. Emma had processed more grief in 50 minutes than most patients managed in weeks of traditional counseling. But I needed to understand what I'd witnessed. I called the maintenance department. Jerry, I need information about the intercom system in room 304. Has there been any recent work done on the wiring? Room 304. Doc, that room's been sealed off for months. We don't service equipment in there anymore. Why not? A long pause. You'd have to ask Dr. Hendricks about that. He was the one who ordered it closed after the Mitchell incident. Dr. Hendricks was our facility director, a man who typically avoided discussing anything that couldn't be neatly categorized in official reports. I found him in his office, reviewing budget documents with his usual methodical precision. Dr. Hendricks, I need to ask about room 304. I've been told there was an incident involving the Mitchell case. His expression darkened. Dr. Walsh, who authorized you to use that room? I showed him the memo. He studied it carefully, then checked his computer. I didn't send this authorization. As far as I know, room 304 remains off limits. What happened with Mitchell? Dr. Hendricks leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. David Mitchell was a counselor here, specialized in family trauma. About 8 months ago, he was conducting a session in 304 with a patient who'd lost her entire family in a car accident. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Midway through the session, the intercom began broadcasting voices, the patient's deceased family members, speaking directly to her. Mitchell thought it was some kind of therapeutic breakthrough until he realized the voices knew things about his own life, his own losses. What kind of things? Personal details, childhood memories, names of people he'd never mentioned to anyone at the facility. The voices began counseling him about his unresolved grief over his brother's death 20 years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to Mitchell? He became obsessed with the room, started scheduling unnecessary sessions there, hoping to make contact with his deceased brother. Other staff reported seeing him there at all hours, talking to empty chairs, responding to voices only he could hear. Where is he now? Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, acute unit. He suffered a complete psychological break, convinced that room 304 was some kind of portal between the living and the dead. That evening, I returned to room 304 with recording equipment, determined to document whatever phenomenon I'd experienced. I sat alone in the room, addressing the intercom directly. If anyone can hear me, I need to understand what's happening in this room. Silence for several minutes. Then, faintly, a voice I didn't recognize. Dr. Walsh, this room holds echoes. Echoes of what? Grief that was never fully processed. Pain that was never fully healed. Some therapeutic relationships don't end when patients are discharged. They persist in places where deep healing was supposed to happen but didn't. Are you Mitchell? I'm everyone who ever tried to heal in this space and left something behind. Every counselor who carried patients' pain home. Every patient who left with unfinished business. The voice grew stronger, multiplying into several distinct speakers. Room 304 was designed as a safe space for processing trauma, but trauma has a way of saturating its environment. Over time, the room began absorbing fragments of every session. Voices, memories, unresolved grief. What do you want? To finish what was started. Every session that ended without closure, every therapeutic relationship that was terminated before healing was complete. We're still here, still trying to help, still trying to heal. The recording equipment was capturing everything, but I realized it wouldn't matter. Who would believe this? What authority would validate the existence of therapeutic ghosts, counseling sessions that persisted beyond death, a room that had become a reservoir for unfinished healing? The voices spoke in unison now. Dr. Walsh, Emma's grandmother wanted you to know. The healing was real. The comfort she received was genuine. Some therapeutic connections transcend the boundaries between life and death. Will she be all right? She will heal. Her grandmother's love didn't end with death. It transformed into something that could reach through whatever barriers separate the living from the departed. Room 304 simply provided the amplification necessary for that connection to manifest audibly. The intercom fell silent, but I could feel the weight of presence in the room. Dozens of unfinished therapeutic relationships, counselors and patients whose work had been interrupted by death, discharge, or circumstance, still trying to complete the healing process. I left room 304 that night and submitted a report recommending its permanent closure, not because it was dangerous, but because it was too powerful. A space where therapeutic relationships persisted beyond their normal boundaries, where grief could find voice, where healing could continue even after the official sessions ended. Emma completed her treatment successfully, often mentioning the comfort she'd received from her grandmother's final words. Her recovery was remarkable, faster and more complete than anyone had expected. Room 304 remains sealed, but sometimes late at night, staff report hearing muffled conversations from behind its locked door, the sound of healing work that continues in the spaces between worlds, where love transcends the final discharge summary and grief finds the voice it needs to transform into peace. The notification chimed at 2:47 a.m., just as I was finally settling into bed after a 17-hour shift. My phone buzzed with an automated message from the Millbrook Patient Management System. Progress note updated. Patient, Torres, Michael. Assigned counselor, Dr. Lisa Park. I ignored it. Michael Torres was one of my most stable patients, a 16-year-old dealing with anxiety following his parents' divorce. His progress had been steady for months. Whatever administrative update had triggered the notification could wait until morning, but the notification chimed again and again. By 3:15 a.m., my phone had received 14 identical alerts about Michael's progress note being updated. I opened my laptop and logged into the patient database, planning to disable the alerts and investigate the glitch in the morning. But when I accessed Michael's file, what I saw made my blood run cold. The progress note I'd written that afternoon had changed. My original entry had read, "Patient shows continued improvement in anxiety management, responsive to cognitive behavioral techniques, mood stable, sleep patterns normalizing. Recommend continued weekly sessions." Now it read, "Patient exhibiting severe regression, hostile to therapeutic intervention, reports auditory hallucinations involving deceased family members, mood unstable, sleep severely disrupted. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation." I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. I'd written the original note 6 hours ago, documenting one of Michael's best sessions in months. He'd been calm, engaged, optimistic about managing his parents' custody arrangements. I scrolled down to check the revision history. According to the timestamp, the note had been edited at 2:47 a.m. by me, but I'd been at home, trying to sleep. I changed the note back to its original content, saved the file, and closed the laptop. System glitch, probably related to the server maintenance they'd been doing. I'd report it to IT in the morning. The notification chimed again at 3:22 a.m. When I reopened the file, my corrected note had changed again. Patient displaying signs of acute psychosis. Refuses to acknowledge reality of family situation. Becoming increasingly agitated and potentially dangerous. Immediate hospitalization recommended. This was impossible. I was the only person with access to Michael's file, and I was at home in my pajamas, staring at words I'd never written describing behaviors I'd never observed. I tried calling the IT help desk, but the overnight support was minimal. The technician who answered seemed distracted and unhelpful. System's been having some weird hiccups tonight, he admitted. Few other counselors called about similar issues. Probably just a database sync problem. Should resolve itself by morning, but the changes continued throughout the night. Every 20 minutes, Michael's progress note rewrote itself, describing increasingly severe symptoms and deteriorating mental state. By 5 a.m., the note read, "Patient no longer responsive to conventional therapy. Exhibits signs of complete psychological collapse. Family reports concerning behavioral changes at home. Status, critical." I drove to the facility before dawn, determined to understand what was happening. The Millbrook campus was nearly deserted at that hour, just security guards and a skeleton nursing staff for the residential patients. I found Michael in the common area, eating breakfast and reading a magazine. He looked exactly as he had during our session the day before, calm, engaged, mentally stable. "Michael, how are you feeling this morning?" He looked up with a slight smile. "Pretty good, Dr. Park. I slept better last night than I have in weeks. I think those relaxation techniques you taught me are really helping." This was the opposite of what his progress notes claimed. According to the digital record, Michael should have been exhibiting severe psychotic symptoms and requiring immediate hospitalization. I returned to my office and opened Michael's file again. The progress note had changed once more. Patient deceased. Found unresponsive in dormitory at 6:30 a.m. Cause of death pending investigation. Case closed. My hands were shaking as I read the words. Michael was alive, sitting in the common area eating cereal. But according to his official record, he was dead. I scrolled down through the file looking for some explanation. At the bottom of the document, I found a section I'd never seen before. Case reassignment history. The entry read, "Original counselor, Dr. Patricia Vance. Status, deceased. Case transferred to Dr. Lisa Park. Date of transfer, today's date." Dr. Patricia Vance had resigned 2 weeks ago, citing personal emergency. She wasn't dead. She'd simply left the facility suddenly and without explanation. But as I stared at the screen, more text appeared. New patient assigned, Dr. Lisa Park, age 29. Primary concerns, obsessive documentation behaviors, inability to distinguish between therapeutic role and patient status, severe anxiety regarding professional competence. My own name, listed as a patient. The file was rewriting itself in real time, adding information about me that I'd never provided. Patient exhibits compulsive need to review and revise case notes. Reports feeling disconnected from therapeutic sessions, as if observing from outside her own body. Shows signs of dissociative episodes during which she believes she is treating patients rather than receiving treatment. "No," I said aloud to the empty office. "This isn't happening." But more text appeared. Patient's condition deteriorating rapidly. Unable to accept patient status despite clear documentation. Recommend intensive reality testing and medication adjustment. I tried to delete the entries about myself, but the text reappeared immediately, more detailed than before. Patient attempting to alter official records. Demonstrates poor reality testing and inability to accept therapeutic intervention. Previous counselor Dr. Patricia Vance exhibited identical symptoms before case transfer. The truth hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Vance hadn't resigned. She'd been a patient, just like I was becoming. The progress notes weren't malfunctioning. They were documenting my own psychological crisis. Disguised as professional work to make it psychologically tolerable, I ran to the common area looking for Michael. He was gone. When I asked the nursing staff, they looked at me with concern. "Dr. Park, there's no patient named Michael Torres on our current roster. Are you feeling all right?" I checked the patient database on my phone. Michael Torres was listed, but in the deceased patient section. Date of death 6 months ago. Cause, suicide following family crisis. The patients I thought I was treating, they were all deceased. Every file in my caseload was from the Memorial Archive, cases that had ended in tragedy months or years ago. I wasn't a counselor. I was a patient whose own psychological crisis had created an elaborate fantasy, where I was successfully treating people who had died before I could help them. The progress note continued writing itself as I watched. Patient showing moments of insight but rapidly retreating into therapeutic fantasy when confronted with reality. Her professional training allows her to create sophisticated delusional systems. Recommend continued supportive care until she can accept her patient status. Dr. Martinez found me in my office 20 minutes later, staring at the screen through tears. "Lisa," she said gently, "it's time for your morning session. Dr. Chen is waiting for you in therapy room B." "I'm not a patient," I whispered. "I'm a counselor. I have cases, appointments, responsibilities. I know this is difficult," Dr. Martinez said, "but you've been a patient here for 3 months. The role-playing therapy has been helpful, but we need to start addressing reality more directly." She showed me my actual file, not the professional records I'd been maintaining, but a patient chart documenting severe occupational burnout, dissociative episodes, and elaborate therapeutic fantasies created to avoid processing my own trauma. The progress notes in my real file were written by other counselors, documenting my gradual improvement as I learned to distinguish between being a healer and being someone who needed healing. "What about Michael Torres?" "Michael was a patient who died 6 months ago," Dr. Martinez explained. "You read about his case during your orientation as a patient. Your mind incorporated his story into your therapeutic fantasy, allowing you to imagine successfully helping him as a way to process your guilt about not being able to help yourself." The digital progress notes had been rewriting themselves because my subconscious was gradually accepting reality, while my conscious mind was still clinging to the fantasy of professional competence. I'm in therapy now, real therapy, as a real patient. The progress notes are written by trained counselors who understand the difference between documenting recovery and creating elaborate defenses against psychological truth, but sometimes I still dream about Michael Torres and the other patients I thought I was helping. In the dreams, they're grateful for the therapy I provided, even though I now know they existed only in the space between my professional training and my personal breakdown. Some progress notes, I've learned, write themselves in the margins between what we wish we could do and what we actually need to receive. I woke up in Memorial Hospital's trauma unit with no memory of the drive home from Millbrook Adolescent Treatment Center. No recollection of the intersection where my sedan had collided with a delivery truck, and 3 weeks of recovery time that stretched ahead like an unwelcome vacation. The accident had been severe enough to require surgery, broken ribs, concussion, internal bleeding that had kept me unconscious for 4 days. But I was alive, healing, and anxious to return to my patients who'd been left without their primary counselor during my unexpected absence. Dr. Hendricks visited me in the hospital during my 2nd week of recovery. "Don't worry about your caseload. Dr. Rebecca Torres," he assured me, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair. "We brought in a temporary replacement, Dr. Sarah Martinez. Very experienced, excellent credentials. Your patients are in good hands." I was grateful but curious. "Where did you find someone available on such short notice?" "She actually contacted us," he said. "Heard about your accident through professional networks and offered to help. Said she'd worked with adolescent trauma cases for years and could step in immediately." The name Sarah Martinez wasn't familiar, but the therapeutic community was large. It made sense that experienced counselors would offer assistance during emergencies. "How are my patients responding to the transition?" "Remarkably well," Dr. Hendricks said, looking somewhat surprised. "Better than we expected, actually. She seems to have an unusual rapport with them. Several have shown significant improvement in just 2 weeks." I returned to work a month later, expecting to resume my regular schedule and thank Dr. Martinez for her assistance. But when I arrived at the facility, the temporary counselor was nowhere to be found. "She finished her assignment yesterday," the receptionist explained, said her work was complete and that you'd be able to continue without difficulty. I asked to see Dr. Martinez's personnel file, hoping to send a thank you note or professional reference. But Human Resources couldn't locate any documentation of her employment. "That's strange," the HR director admitted. "We should have copies of her credentials, her temporary contract, emergency contact information. But there's nothing in our system under Sarah Martinez." I spoke with Dr. Hendricks, who seemed equally puzzled. "She definitely worked here," he insisted. "I met with her several times, reviewed her approach with your patients. But you're right, I can't seem to find any of her paperwork." The mystery deepened when I resumed sessions with my patients. All of them mentioned Dr. Martinez frequently, describing her work with remarkable consistency. "She understood exactly what I was going through," said Marcus Rivera. "A 17-year-old dealing with severe depression. It was like she'd experienced everything I was feeling." Dr. Martinez asked the right questions, added Jessica Park, 16, struggling with anxiety after her parents' divorce. She seemed to know what I needed to hear before I even said anything. Their descriptions of Dr. Martinez were strikingly similar. Calm voice, dark hair, kind eyes that seemed familiar somehow. She'd used therapeutic techniques that perfectly complemented my own methods, as if she understood my treatment approach intuitively. But when I asked for more specific details, the patient's memories became vague. What did she look like exactly? I asked Marcus. He paused, his expression growing uncertain. Like you, I think. Similar height, similar voice. But older, maybe? It's hard to remember clearly. Jessica had the same response. She reminded me of someone, but I can't place who. Her eyes were familiar, like I'd seen them before. Over the following weeks, I noticed something strange. My patients would occasionally call me Dr. Martinez during sessions, then quickly correct themselves with embarrassed apologies. Sorry, Dr. Torres. I don't know why I keep doing that, but it wasn't just occasional slips. Sometimes they would speak to me as if I were continuing conversations I'd never had, referencing therapeutic insights I'd never shared, building on treatment strategies I'd never implemented. Like Dr. Martinez said last week, Amy Chen would begin, then describe sophisticated therapeutic concepts that aligned perfectly with my own approach, but that I'd never discussed with her. I started reviewing my patients' files, looking for documentation of Dr. Martinez's work during my absence. The session notes were there, written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow found familiar. The insights were professional, the treatment approaches exactly what I would have chosen, the progress documentation remarkably thorough. But the signature at the bottom of each note was illegible, and the therapeutic style felt like an echo of my own methods, familiar but slightly different, as if someone were imitating my approach from memory. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my anxiety was connected to feeling abandoned, Jessica explained during one session. She said that sometimes people leave us temporarily, but the care they provide creates a kind of continuity. Continuity? Like, even when someone isn't physically present, their support continues through the work they've already done. She said healing creates lasting connections that persist even when the healer has to step away. I was taking notes, but Jessica's words seemed to be describing something beyond standard therapeutic concepts. Dr. Martinez said some counselors leave parts of themselves with their patients, not intentionally, but because true therapeutic relationships create bonds that transcend physical presence. That evening, I stayed late to review security footage from my absence, hoping to catch glimpses of the mysterious Dr. Martinez, but the surveillance system showed only empty corridors during the hours when she should have been conducting sessions. The therapy rooms appeared unoccupied during my patients' scheduled appointments, yet their session notes documented detailed conversations and breakthrough moments. I called Dr. Hendricks at home. The security footage doesn't show anyone in the therapy rooms during the times Dr. Martinez was supposedly seeing patients. A long pause. That's impossible, Rebecca. I walked past those rooms myself. I could hear conversations, therapeutic dialogue. The patients were definitely meeting with someone, but there's no visual record of her presence. Camera malfunction, he suggested, but his voice carried doubt. I began interviewing other staff members who'd interacted with Dr. Martinez during my absence. Their descriptions were consistent, but oddly imprecise. A professional woman who seemed to understand the facility's protocols perfectly, who blended seamlessly into the therapeutic environment. But no one could recall specific conversations with her. No one remembered her arriving or leaving. No one had seen her in the break room, the parking lot, or anywhere outside the therapy wing. She seemed to belong here, one nurse said, like she'd always been part of the team. The truth began forming in my mind. Impossible. Unscientific, but increasingly undeniable. During my next session with Marcus, I decided to test my theory. Marcus, when you think about Dr. Martinez, what do you remember most clearly? Her voice, he said immediately. It sounded exactly like yours, Dr. Torres. Same tone, same way of asking questions. But she seemed to know things about me that I'd never told anyone. What kind of things? Personal stuff. Family dynamics, childhood memories, fears I'd never put into words. It was like she could see inside my head, or like she'd been there during all the experiences that shaped me. I looked at Marcus carefully. What if I told you that Dr. Martinez might not have been a separate person? He considered this, his expression growing thoughtful rather than confused. You mean, like she was part of you somehow? What would you think about that possibility? I'd think, Marcus said slowly, that some counselors care so much about their patients that part of them stays behind to keep helping, even when their body can't be present. That night, I dreamed about the accident, but from a different perspective. I watched my own car approach the intersection, saw the moment of impact, witnessed my body being taken to the hospital. But part of me remained at Millbrook, continuing to provide therapy to patients who needed consistency during my physical absence. Dr. Martinez had been real, not as a separate person, but as the therapeutic part of myself that couldn't abandon my patients, even during medical crisis. My commitment to their healing had created a kind of professional continuity that manifested as a substitute counselor with my insights, my methods, and my deep understanding of their specific needs. The patients call me Dr. Martinez sometimes because they're recognizing the part of me that never left them, the therapeutic presence that persisted beyond physical availability. Some healing relationships I've learned are strong enough to transcend the limitations of bodies that can be injured, ensuring that care continues even when the caregiver cannot. The notification arrived at 4:47 p.m. on my final Friday at Millbrook Adolescent Treatment Center. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, exit interview scheduled for 5:00 p.m., conference room B, mandatory attendance. I'd been expecting the appointment for weeks, ever since submitting my resignation letter. After 8 years of adolescent psychiatric counseling, I was burned out, emotionally depleted, ready to transition to private practice with adult patients. The exit interview was standard procedure, a bureaucratic formality to close out my employment officially. Conference room B was located in the administrative wing, a sterile space I'd rarely visited during my tenure. The woman waiting for me was someone I'd never seen before, middle-aged, wearing a dark suit with silver hair pulled back severely. Her nameplate read, Dr. Patricia Morrison, Personnel Evaluation. Dr. Walsh, please have a seat. This should take about an hour. She opened a thick file folder and pulled out what appeared to be a standard exit interview form. Let's begin with your current stress levels. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your emotional exhaustion? 8, I answered honestly. The caseload here is intense. I'm looking forward to a less demanding practice. Dr. Morrison made a note, then looked up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And your plans after leaving Millbrook? Private practice. I've rented office space downtown, focusing on adult therapy rather than adolescent crisis intervention. Interesting. She wrote something else, then flipped through several pages in my file. Dr. Walsh, I need to review your employment history to complete your evaluation. You submitted your resignation 3 weeks ago, citing professional burnout and desire for career change. That's correct. Before that, you experienced a series of challenging cases that contributed to your decision to leave. The Henderson boy who attempted suicide during your treatment. My stomach clenched. Michael Henderson had been one of my most difficult cases, a 17-year-old whose depression had worsened despite months of therapy. His suicide attempt had devastated me, even though my supervisor assured me I'd followed all proper protocols. That case was particularly difficult, I admitted. And before the Henderson case, you struggled with the Morrison girl who died in a car accident after your session about accepting her parents' divorce. I frowned. There was no Morrison girl. Are you thinking of someone else's caseload? Dr. Morrison consulted her notes. Jennifer Morrison, age 16. You treated her for 6 months before her death. Your session notes indicate significant guilt over the therapeutic approach you'd chosen. I never treated anyone named Morrison. And I think there's a coincidence with names here. Your surname is Morrison. She smiled again, that same cold expression. Let's continue with the chronology. Before Morrison, there was the Chen family tragedy. 3 siblings lost in a house fire after you'd been working with them on family dynamics. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. None of these cases were familiar to me, but Dr. Morrison was describing them as if she were reading from my actual files. I don't recall treating any Chen siblings. Memory can be selective during periods of extreme stress, she said gently. Before the Chen case, you handled the Williams boy who overdosed on medication you'd recommended adjusting. I don't prescribe medication. I'm not a psychiatrist. Of course not. But you do make recommendations that influence prescribing decisions. She flipped more pages. Before Williams, there was the Rodriguez girl who was found hanging in her bedroom 3 days after your session about coping with trauma. Each name she mentioned felt like a physical blow. These weren't my cases, but somehow they felt familiar. Nightmare scenarios every therapist feared. Patients who died under care. Therapeutic relationships that had ended in tragedy. Dr. Morrison, I think there's been a mistake. These cases aren't from my caseload, aren't they? She pulled out a different folder, this one marked with my name and employee number. Every case I've mentioned is documented in your files. Dr. Walsh, each therapeutic relationship that ended in patient death, each suicide, each tragic accident that occurred during or immediately after your treatment. I reached for the folder, but she pulled it back. Before Rodriguez, there was the Park family murder-suicide. The father killed his wife and children after you'd been treating him for anger management. This is impossible. I've never had a patient die during my treatment. Before Park, there was the Thompson boy who shot 3 classmates at school. You'd been working with him on impulse control. The room felt suddenly cold, and I was beginning to feel dizzy. Each name Dr. Morrison mentioned triggered flashes of memory, brief images of therapeutic sessions, case notes, family meetings, but they felt like memories of nightmares rather than actual experiences. Dr. Walsh, before Thompson, there was the Davis girl who set fire to her foster home, killing her foster parents and 2 other children. Stop, I said, my voice barely steady. These aren't my cases. Before Davis, there was the Miller boy who drove his car into a crowd at his high school graduation. I said, stop. Dr. Morrison set down her papers and looked at me with something approaching sympathy. Dr. Walsh, you've done this interview many times before. Every few years, you reach a breaking point, resign from your position, and attempt to leave Millbrook. But you always come back. That's not possible. This is my first resignation, is it? She opened another section of the file. Your first resignation was filed 6 years ago after the Peterson case. Before that, 4 years ago after the Kelly incident. Before that, 3 years ago after the Murphy tragedy. She showed me resignation letters, all in my handwriting, all citing the same reasons. Burnout, emotional exhaustion, desire for career change. The dates went back 8 years, covering my entire employment at Millbrook. Dr. Walsh, you don't leave Millbrook because you can't leave Millbrook. Your connection to this place, to these patients, is too strong. Every time you try to start over, you find yourself back here, treating the same kinds of cases, experiencing the same tragic outcomes. I stared at the resignation letters, all signed with my name, all following the same pattern. Why don't I remember resigning before? Because remembering would make it impossible to continue working. Your mind resets itself each time, allowing you to believe this is your first experience with these tragic cases, your first attempt to leave. She pulled out another document, a psychological evaluation dated 2 weeks ago. Dr. Walsh, you're not leaving Millbrook because you've never actually worked here in the traditional sense. What do you mean? You died 6 years ago in a car accident on your way to your first day of work at this facility. But your commitment to helping adolescent patients was so strong that part of you remained behind, creating an elaborate therapeutic fantasy where you successfully treated dozens of troubled teenagers. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't support me. That's not possible. The tragic cases I've been describing, they're not your therapeutic failures. They're the actual fates of the patients you never got to help because you died before you could begin working here. Your consciousness has been replaying the same scenarios over and over, trying to save them, failing each time, then resetting to try again. She showed me a newspaper clipping. Local therapist dies in car accident en route to new job. The photo was unmistakably me. The date 6 years ago, the day I was supposed to start work at Millbrook. The exit interviews are part of the cycle. Dr. Morrison continued. Every time you reach emotional breaking point, you attempt to leave, we conduct this interview, and then you begin again with a fresh set of patients and no memory of previous attempts. Who are you? I'm the part of your psyche that understands what happened to you. The administrative voice that tries to process your death and help you accept that your therapeutic mission can't be completed because you're no longer alive to complete it. The room was spinning now, and I could feel my grip on reality loosening. What happens now? The same thing that always happens. You'll wake up Monday morning believing you're starting your first day at Millbrook. You'll meet a new caseload of troubled adolescents, become emotionally invested in their healing, and gradually realize that you can't save them because they're already lost. She handed me a form that I somehow knew would be the final document in my file. But when I looked at it, the signature line was already filled out, with my name and tomorrow's date. You've signed this before, Dr. Walsh, many times. It's your agreement to continue the cycle, to keep trying to help patients who are beyond help, to maintain the therapeutic relationship, even though you're no longer capable of providing actual healing. I looked at the signature, recognizing my handwriting but having no memory of signing the document. How many times have I done this? This will be your 47th resignation and reset. Each cycle lasts approximately 6 months, long enough for you to form deep therapeutic attachments to your assigned patients, short enough to prevent you from realizing that none of your interventions actually affect their outcomes. Can I break the cycle? Dr. Morrison's expression softened, only by accepting that you died before you could help anyone, that your therapeutic mission ended in a car accident 6 years ago, and that holding on to the fantasy of professional success is preventing you from finding peace. I looked at the signed form, the resignation letters, the tragic case files that represented my inability to save people I'd never actually met. What if I don't sign? Then you continue the cycle. Monday morning, fresh start, new patients, same inevitable outcomes. The only difference is whether you carry the weight of knowing why you always fail. I picked up the pen, staring at my signature already written on the form with tomorrow's date. What happens if I accept the truth? Then your therapeutic mission ends, and you find whatever comes after for people who cared too much to let death interrupt their work. I signed the form again, directly over my existing signature. As the ink dried, I felt the weight of 6 years of failed therapeutic relationships lifting from my shoulders. Some counselors, I realized, become so committed to healing that they continue practicing even after death, trapped in cycles of trying to save patients who were already lost before the work began. But understanding the limitation of posthumous therapy was the first step toward accepting that some healing requires letting go rather than holding on. The interview room began to fade, and I finally understood that my real exit had been 6 years ago, in a car accident that had ended my therapeutic career before it could begin.